Welcome to Quiet Scare, where horror doesn't scream, it whispers. This collection is built around a simple, terrifying idea that certain places aren't just abandoned, they're waiting. The theme of abandoned places, chilling hauntings found after dark, is woven through every story here. These aren't just fiction, they're real experiences that have been thoughtfully adapted by our team. The art is in honoring the original encounters while enhancing the atmosphere, turning them into sleep-friendly tales that carry the authentic weight of documented truth. You can help the channel grow and find more stories like these by liking, subscribing, and hitting the bell icon for notifications. We'll have a few brief ads at the start, but after that the experience is uninterrupted, so you can simply listen as you drift off. Sleep well and dream dark. I kept a crumpled grocery bag under the passenger seat that I told myself I would toss and never did. It had a flashlight, a flathead screwdriver, a cheap disposable camera I hadn't used, and a marker that bled through anything. The bag slid and thumped whenever I took the sweeping turns up Lookout Mountain Road, and the sound made me think about all the little things you keep around for no good reason, until one night puts them to use. Even when I wasn't headed toward trouble, the bag was there, pressed against the carpet like an intent I didn't want to say out loud. The night this all happened, the air had turned clear and thinner with elevation, and the city was a scatter of warm dots below us. My friend Eli had texted earlier about doing something that felt like getting away with something. We were both old enough to know better and young enough to choose the first feeling over the second. We met at a gas station off South Golden Road, traded a few grins that tried to be casual, and then let the mountain dark take us. The place we aimed for wasn't on a map. It perched above a drainage where scrub pines gave way to rock and faded grass. It was a squat structure with a sloped roof and one fogged pane of glass, too small to be a house and too stubborn to be a shed. The chain link fence around it leaned, and the no trespassing sign had been sunburned down to a white rectangle, unreadable from the road. The hill pitched just enough that when you stood beside the building, the city lights fell away, and the night pressed close. I killed the engine at the pullout, and we sat for a second, listening to heat tick out of the hood. The wind up there had a dry paper sound as it moved through grass and old plastic. I remember the smell of sap and dust. I pulled the grocery bag from under the seat and felt the shape of each thing through thin plastic. You always know which object your hand is going to choose before your voice does. We went through the fence where someone else had gone through before, pushing the curled corner wider with our shoulders. The door had a simple latch in a place where a lock used to live. The screwdriver took its time, and the wood made a little groan that felt more like a question than a protest. When the door swung, a cool air seeped out like the inside had been holding its breath. We stepped into the kind of dark that isn't total, where your eyes make sense faster than your brain. Inside there was a narrow bench along one wall, a dusty metal chair and some paper taped to the studs, pages the size of a school poster, bubbled and curled. I swept my flashlight across them and saw a map once. Some notices so old their ink had washed into itself in a black and white photograph in a frame the size of a dinner plate. The frame hung off a nail at a tilt. The photo showed a family in front of something that looked like this building before it grew old. A man with a thin tie, a woman in a sleeveless dress. Between them, a girl, maybe 9, with her hair pulled back and a set to her mouth like she was trying to be serious. Eli liked to leave his mark. He went for the marker right away and tagged the chair, tagged the inside of the door, tagged a piece of plywood lying against the wall with a word that was funny to him, and that meant nothing to the place. I took the camera from the bag and thought about being the kind of person who takes pictures of his own mischief. The lens was plastic, and the viewfinder added a tiny second room inside my field of vision. The beam of my flashlight made dust float and fall like slow snow. We told ourselves it was nothing, that this was all junk left to rot on a ridge nobody remembered. We weren't brave so much as bored. Eli looked at the framed image and laughed a little at something only he heard. He slid the frame up off the nail and held it with his thumb smudging the lower edge where the paper had lifted inside the glass. "She looks like somebody from school," he said, and I told him he was seeing patterns because that's what you say when you don't want to admit you see them too. The glass had a crack running from corner to corner, the kind that decides its own path. Eli's laugh trailed off, Then he did what he always did when he didn't like the way silence made him feel. He made noise. He tilted the frame toward the floor and dropped it from shoulder height. The sound wasn't sharp. It was a soft, tired shiver like a stack of pages slipping. Paper flared out under the broken glass. I felt an immediate heat in my face, and then a cold that slid behind it. The kind that makes your tongue go heavy with words you won't say. Man, why, I said, and the question came out smaller than I wanted. He shrugged and ground his heel on the mess like he was putting out a cigarette that had never been lit. Some pieces of the photo stuck to the underside of the glass, damp with old glue. The girl's eyes were intact in one corner that had escaped the glass, now canted at an angle that made them feel like they were looking past me rather than at me. The room settled around that fact. I cleaned nothing. I turned the frame over with the edge of my shoe to stop looking at faces. My hand tightened around the plastic camera until it creaked. The motif of paper returned in everything. The way the notices murmured in the draft through the door. The map's edges that lifted like tongues. The way the ruined photograph lifted and fell when we moved. If there was a rule about not taking apart paper that has lived longer than you, we were breaking it. I stepped outside to breathe. The wind pressed the fabric of my shirt flat and then let it go. The hill fell away down to a cut of darkness where the drainage ran, and beyond that a shoulder of trees made a jagged line against the sky. My flashlight made a pale cone. The beam softened any hard edges. Off to the left of the building, at the line where grass thickened and brush started, someone stood. I saw the silhouette first. A person who was smaller than me by a little. Shoulders narrow, hands at her sides. The hair looked like it had been pulled back smooth and then loosened by the air. I told myself I was seeing a trick of shape and contrast. The brain is greedy with faces. I moved the light toward her and then away, as if not shining on her would erase the question. The person didn't move. A slow sensation took its time along my back from the bottom up, like a cold hand placed palm flat and drawing itself up between my shoulder blades. Eli came to the door, the latch tapping wood as it swung. He stepped just outside and followed my gaze. He didn't say anything, which isn't like him. Silence is loud when it belongs to the person who loves a laugh. "Hello?" he tried, and the word felt odd up here, like a rock thrown toward a well you think is shallow. The person by the brush turned her head, and I don't know if it was the wind or her, but a strand of hair moved across her cheek. She didn't step forward or backward. She was the kind of still that feels intentional. The beam of light fell low and caught outlines of shoes that weren't hiking shoes for a moment. That stuck with me later. I saw flat soles like the kind worn to church in a photograph made to last. A shiver of paper came from behind us in the room where the frame lay, and Eli looked at me because the sound didn't make sense if we were out here. A set of headlights appeared high on the access road, not on the one we had used, but the one only people who were meant to be here used. The night changed shape because someone else was now part of it. "Sheriff's office," a voice called from the road, calm and firm at the same time. No rush in it. "Come on out with your hands where I can see them." The words traveled up the slope. The metal parts of the building pinged as the engine idled below. In the space between the officer's first call and his second, I looked back toward the brush. The narrow shoulders were still there, the hands at the sides. The chin turned as if considering the angle of us and the road. The light clipped the edge of an ear. I could have sworn the outline matched the girl in the ruined frame. The height, the way she held herself. Another call from the road, more direct now. Eli whispered, "We're going," but it came out like he was negotiating with a part of himself. The door behind us swung and tapped again. If that photo hadn't been broken, if that shape by the brush had been a neighbor out for a walk or a kid in a hoodie, we weren't going to find out. The space between facts and the stories that glue them is where fear grows. A shape that fits. We went for the backside of the building where the slope broke into a path no one had made on purpose. The grass scratched our shins. Rocks moved under our shoes. The officer called again from the road. Closer now. The angle of his flashlight reaching past the doorframe and lighting the dust in a column. "Hey, stop." The words flared in my chest. I kept breathing in small measured sips that felt like tearing small strips off a page. We slid down the hill too fast. I grabbed at brush and got a handful of dry stems. A branch snagged my sleeve and then let go. I felt the bad weight of the camera in my pocket. The way a pocket knife feels heavier when you realize you shouldn't have it with you. Eli was ahead of me, his shoulders a darker shape against the lighter dark. He fell once in a hollow and said something that might have been a curse, then popped up again with that elastic way his anger always snapped to humor. At the drainage, we crouched and listened. The car up on the access road idled, and another set of tires crackled over gravel, the sound coming from the way we hadn't driven. Light reached without precise aim, sliding over the scrub. A second voice called from somewhere uphill and off to the right, and the words were practical. "We've got 2, maybe 3. Tracks at the fence." The number hung there. 2, maybe 3. Maybe 3 because someone had seen a third figure. Maybe 3 because the shape at the brush had joined us in the officer's count. Maybe 3 because in the way adrenaline distorts time and space, we had become more than ourselves. We hugged the drainage bed and moved through the shadow of a culvert that smelled like damp rust. On the far side, the hill rose and then flattened toward a line of pines. We threaded between trunks until the world behind us felt like it belonged to someone else. The lights on the road stayed fixed in their places. The voices didn't follow. Law enforcement had announced, not swarmed. Confrontation had happened, and then it had been about how much we wanted to stay inside it. We chose not to. We reached the pullout where my car sat, pretending it had never been anywhere but there, and I felt a stupid gratitude for the way machines wait for you until they don't. We slid in. Doors softened their latches, and rolled without lights down the grade until turning them on made sense. Back on South Golden Road, the familiar traffic and sodium light did what it always does. It made the mountain things recede as if they had been part of a story we halfway told. We didn't talk for a while, because anything we said would have required us to pick a side between what we knew and what we felt. Word travels in a small place even when names don't. 2 days later, my uncle had me help him in his garage behind his house. The kind of place that smells like oil and old cardboard, and where the radio always runs quietly in the background. He has lived here longer than I have been alive, and knows the pace of the town because he is the pace of the town in some small way. He handed me a box of spark plugs, and in the same motion he asked if I'd been up bright enough to see the lights over the ridge the other night. I said no in the way you do when you don't want to supply more, and he didn't press. He told me like he was telling me the weather, that the ridge shelf used to have a place where a family stayed in summers, before the city pushed up and the county tightened codes. Back when, he said, which is his shorthand for when no one cared who did what, where, until something made them care. There had been a fight there once, and not the kind that leaves people just bruised. He didn't say who hit whom or how. He said a young one died and the others packed up like smoke. They never did fix it up right, he added, as if repair had been a choice left on a table. He wasn't trying to make a ghost story. He wasn't the type. He was making a point about leaving other people's things alone, and about how places with old grief in them don't need new damage. He didn't know what we had done, but he knew me. He loosened a stubborn cap with a practiced flick of his wrist, and then handed me the tool before I could ask for it. He looked at my hands and said nothing about the fine scratches on the backs of them that sap had reddened, and the way paper can carve with a clean line. Eli came by later, and we sat on the tailgate and talked around what had happened without touching it. He joked about cardio we didn't plan on and about the way he'd rolled and popped up like a cat, and then he ran out of jokes. He didn't bring up the photograph. I did, because the feeling wouldn't let me sit still. You know that part, I said, choosing a middle place between saying it and not. He knew. He said he thought he saw someone by the brush. He didn't say girl, didn't say small, didn't say familiar. We backed it up to a safe distance and left it there. On nights since, when I drive up to clear my head, I don't pull off at that cut in the fence. I keep my eyes on the lines painted on the road, and don't check the margin where the building sits in its little pocket of dark. The grocery bag still lives beneath the passenger seat, and every time I brake for the curve at the overlook, the bag slides forward and touches my ankle like a reminder that small choices add up to change a night. I haven't thrown it out because I have learned to be honest about who I have been, and careful with who I might still be. Sometimes a gust comes down off the ridge and pushes through the car's seals, just enough to make the map in the door pocket whisper. I think about the first time I held a photograph as a kid, and how heavy it felt for something so thin. It was a piece of paper with a life inside it. That night up on the ridge, Eli broke a photograph and the room breathed differently afterward. The figure by the brush didn't run from the light or toward it. The officer's voice rose, and we chose the kind of exit you choose when you realize you're no longer the only person writing the rules of a spot on a hill. I'm not the type to decide what I saw. I know what I did. I know what the air felt like and what the paper sounded like when it shifted without a hand on it. I know my uncle told me a piece of context that slid into place like a page back into a book. I know the fear I carry stays quiet in daylight and changes shape when the sun goes down. Lookout Mountain hasn't moved, and the ridge is still a ridge. The next time I drove past that pullout after dark, I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't reach for the radio. It was enough to aim my headlights at the lines ahead and let the hill keep what we gave it. I chose the firewatch tower because I like seeing the land from a higher order. Ridges become ribs, creeks sketch veins, and the dark folds into something legible. It was an abandoned structure, one I'd seen on old topo maps and once visited in daylight to check the stairs and the cabin floor for rot. The iron-grated steps held. The wind gnawed the guy wires. It was far enough from any town that the night would be clean. Solitude is usually a feature for me, not a risk factor. The weather held clear into evening, the moon a fingernail, the stars crowded and bright. I climbed the exterior staircase with my pack thudding rhythmically against my spine, the metal ringing under my boots. The cabin at the top was a single-room box with a broken stove, 2 windows intact, and a door that still latched if you lifted and cocked it just so. I unrolled my pad, checked my water, set my headlamp to low, and leaned my elbows on the sill. Below, the forest fell away like black surf. That's when the lights appeared. They weren't random. They weren't campfires or the jittering strobe of headlamps on switchbacks. There were 5 at first, then 7, evenly spaced, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern across the valley floor. They drifted along lines no trail would follow, crossed deadfall without a stutter, held spacing as if measured. The spacing itself changed, widening, tightening like a net cast and drawn in invisible hands. I watched for vehicles, for the safety flash of a utility truck, but there was no sound but wind. The valley didn't light up. The lights weren't illuminating the ground so much as tracing it. Intelligent, I thought, and felt foolish for thinking it. I reached for my phone to shoot video. Battery showed 78%. The screen froze. Then the clock rolled backward, numbers skittering to noon, then 00, then the display went black and stayed that way no matter how long I held the power. My GPS blinked, acquiring satellites, then no fix, then reset and hung. My headlamp flickered down to ember and sputtered out. Even my compass, an old brass thing that had never lied to me, began to swing and dither like it had drunk bad wine. I shook it. The needle trembled against the card, indecisive. I tried a cheap backup flashlight and its beam pixelated in the air before going dead. The cabin had no power. There was nothing to interfere, and yet every tool I had trusted to make night smaller suddenly belonged to it. From the stairs came a sound I knew immediately and could not reconcile. Metal on metal, a slow scrape, like something hard and patient sliding along the outer edge of the steps. I pressed myself flat to the inside of the door, eye to the peephole someone had drilled years ago. The spiral of the staircase sloped down into darkness. I could see nothing, but the sound rose, scrape, pause, scrape, ascending. The lights below answered the motion above. They pulled inward, in a smooth, mindless agreement, converging at the base of the tower, as if the tower were a drain and the valley a sink. Voices rode up on the wind then, the way creek noise sometimes pretends it has language when you're tired. These weren't that. They were human adjacent. Consonants trying and failing to form in a throat the wrong shape. A chorus of almost words, layered and unplaceable, moving closer. When people talk about whispers, they mean secrets. This felt like instructions. I killed my silhouette by stepping back from the window. The latch on the door rattled with the next scrape. Something feathered the doorknob, deliberate, inquisitive. It did not try to force entry. It tested the concept. My breath sounded like a flaw in a recording. The cabin had one bright feature, a second window opposite the door, the one that faced the downslope. where the steel supports pinned to the bedrock. My rope was coiled between my pad and pack. Of all the reasons I carry a rope when I go alone, unseen presence on the staircase had never made the top 10. I looped it around the leg of the dead stove and the strut of the window frame, double-checked the knot by hand because nothing electronic would help me now, and threw the free end out into the cool dark. The door's latch turned a quarter, twitched against resistance, and eased back. The scraping sound paused like a listener was thinking. I swung myself out, boots against the exterior wall, fingers searching for purchase. The rope burned against my gloved palm. I went down. Midway, I looked down not because I wanted to, but because my body was making sure down still existed. The converged lights made a slow turning shape at the base, a geometry that wanted to be a circle but was too precise for the soft edge my flashlight would have given it. In their pale wash, I could see a ring around the tower's footings. Bare earth in a perfect arc, as if a compass had been pinned to the central post and scribed around. It wasn't just dirt. The grasses at the edge were the color of old paper, canted as if shocked and left to collapse. A circle of dead plant matter, exact and wrong in the way exact can be wrong. Like a laugh at a funeral. The voices intensified, layers slipping over each other. Not in alarm, but in alignment. I touched down too hard, knees jarring, cut the rope with the tiny blade on my harness so I wouldn't be tethered to the tower, and stepped and found my heel in the dead ring. The temperature of the air inside it felt different, like something sweet and sour at once. I stepped out as if from a chalk line. Every hair on my arms lifted. There are techniques for moving at night without light. Counts paces. Keep a hand on the contour like it's a railing. Fix the mountain's shoulder against the same star, and keep it there. The sky had been generous moments before. Now even the stars felt muffled. The lights did not chase. They shifted, held, adjusted, as if whatever was on the stairs had drawn their attention the way it had drawn mine. The scraping resumed, faster now, like it had not expected me to leave that way, and was catching up to its own surprise. I ran, not the stupid kind of run, not the blind thrash that takes you off a spur into a ravine, but the tight economical stride of someone whose body knows what terror costs the lungs, and pays the bill anyway. The voices kept pace without approaching, like I was passing a line of radios tuned between stations. When I tripped on deadfall, I fell in a shape that protected the ribs you need, and got up without thinking. I hit a logging road by feel, and turned downhill. Kept the mountain on the same side, counted bends. The cut slope on my left smelled like dust. My headlamp did not come back. The cheap flashlight felt like a useless talisman in my pocket. When the car finally appeared as a darker dark, I half expected its locks to work like the door had. Turn a quarter, pause, reconsider. The fob was dead. I used the key. The dome light didn't come on. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught reluctantly like it hated having to return to a world where its rules applied. I drove faster than I should have on gravel. Behind me, the tower's silhouette disappeared, and with it the lights, or more precisely, they ceased to be in the part of the world I could verify. I didn't sleep when I got back to the motel. Morning made the coffee taste like metal. I drove into the nearest town because it is what you do after a thing like that. You route yourself through proof of other people. At the gas station, a man with a face that had done more winters than mine noticed the rope burn on my glove and the mud on my knees. He asked where I'd been like it was conversation, and when I told him the tower's name, his expression didn't change, which felt like its own choice. "You shouldn't go up there after dark," he said, laying 4 words down as if they'd been laid down to him. Not since the boy. What boy? He took a moment that belonged to someone else's story. Years back, camped on the landing. Folks looked. Never found him. Found a ring, though. He drew a circle in the air with a finger. Absent-minded, perfect. "Plants don't grow right there." Sheriff said lightning. "We don't get lightning like that. Other things, too. Radios go funny. People hear, carrying on." He watched my face for the piece I wasn't going to offer. He didn't ask. I didn't say. "You're lucky," he added finally, and it wasn't a compliment. I have tried to inventory what happened without granting it anything it didn't earn. I chose an isolated, abandoned structure after dark. I observed multiple artificial lights moving against the valley in patterns I cannot map to trail, vehicle, or prank. Every device I carried failed in a way that synchronized. Something climbed the outer stairs and tested the door without speaking. The lights converged, and the air carried voices I could not understand. At the base of the tower was a perfect circle of dead plant matter. A local connected it to a prior disappearance, and to other things. I left in the only way I could, and did not turn back. I still walk, but not alone, not high, and never toward anything made of grating and steel. The sound of metal on metal makes my jaw ache. Sleep has gone thin. When it does come, it brings the smell inside that ring. Sweet and sour like something that isn't rot but knows where rot lives. Screens in the dark feel untrustworthy. If a handful of lights appear out of place in a field, holiday decorations, farm trucks, I measure their distance and their spacing before I let my breath out. There is a difference between unknown and unknowable. I used to camp because the unknown made the night rich. Now I know there are things that stand just outside the circle you draw with your headlamp, waiting, measuring the circle you made, and the one they brought, and they do not care which one you step into first. I set my coffee on the hood and laid out fresh batteries in a neat row, positive ends all pointing east. It was a habit I picked up from an older investigator who swore orientation mattered, and when you're alone behind a locked fence after dark, habits feel like rails. The car ticked as it cooled. Beyond the chain link, the old campus stretched into a darker kind of quiet. I had been through the records, the small town papers, the redacted PDFs of state audits. The numbers made a steady dull line in my head. I turned the headlamp to red, checked each camera, clicked the windscreen mount on the small thermal, and told myself to keep this one simple. The complex sat south of Worcester, past the 24-hour station on Grafton Street where I bought the coffee. The approach was a frost-stiff service road skirting an overgrown field, the buildings rising out of scrub by degrees, boiler stack, water tower, laundry block, then the long brick wards with their glazed windows and blank faces. Everything on the map was nameless now. Buildings were labeled by letters that had flaked off the signs decades ago. The fence bowed inward where deer had made a path, and someone had wired a gap wider with a twist of baling wire. I noted the route with a pen light, counted off paces to the south wing door, and started a body cam just to have a continuous record of the walk. I told the recorder my baseline in the first hallway as I always did. Location, time, weather still. Wind minimal from the northwest. Just so that later, when I listened, I would know what was supposed to be there. The air smelled like paper left in a hot car. Static lifted the small hairs on my forearms, even under my jacket. I thought it might be the dry, cold-stirring lint and insulation fibers, so I brushed at my sleeves and moved on. The south wing service door had a rusted push bar and a rectangle of wire mesh glass that gave a view of shadowed tile. I tested it and it opened a patient inch. The metal shrieked against the floor in a thin mechanical wail that ran up my teeth, so I eased it and found the angle where the sound stopped. Inside was the geometry of the old way of building institutions. Long corridor, evenly spaced doorways, tile that reflected back a faint red-tinted version of my headlamp. The windows were high, set with wired glass, their paint cracked like lakebed mud. I swept the thermal no more than a yard ahead, and kept the lens on a strap. One of my cameras rode chest high. A handheld recorder sat in my left palm, its levels visible as a small tremor even when I was still. The complex had been associated with a high volume of deaths on paper, and many more in the kind of talk that happens among people who work nights. The word I kept running into in those stories was piling incidents piling, files piling, bodies in winters when the ground kept its grip. Maybe it was suggestion, but I felt the building put a mild pressure on my ears like the slow descent in an elevator. My routine reasserted itself. I named the side halls, the count of doors to the first corner, the fact that a metal utility cart lay on its side with one wheel gone. The recorder picked up a soft tick. I held it steady and listened. The tick was a slow metronome, tap, pause, tap, with a hollow quality like a pipe cooling. I stood still until my own breathing settled and leaned out with the headlamp off. The sound did not change when I took a step. It did not change when I waited. The level meter barely lifted. I marked the beat and moved toward it by halves. At the turn, The south corridor ended in a set of double doors with wired glass panels. Just to their left, a nurse's station opened onto a bay of shelves. The tick was inside the station, coming from lower than the counter. I took a knee. The light caught a drip pattern in old varnish, a web of hairline cracks and a plexiglass sneeze guard, a scatter of paper clips, and a pointer with a felt tip gone hard. The tick resolved, finally. As the thermal-oriented, I had been hearing a loose strip of duct and an air vent shifting with the tiny breaths of air, still moving in the building. I said the word vent into the recorder and let the fear dial back one click. Farther in, my left hand flared with a sharp, neat pain, as if something had taken a single precise bite from the web between thumb and forefinger. I jerked, reflexive, and the recorder thumped against my jacket. I brought the headlamp close and saw no broken glass, no splinter. The skin flushed, and a bright pinpoint of sting stayed hot for a few seconds and faded. I told myself I had scraped the edge of a file drawer. I put the recorder back in place and kept my hands tucked closer to my sides. The crawling came in the next hallway. It was not the normal brush of cobwebs. I know that brush, the fine strand across the mouth of a door that you never quite see. This was a traveling sensation, like foam moving over ankles in the ocean, only it was dry and it moved the wrong way. It started above my wrist bones and rolled up under the sleeves to the crook of each elbow, then faded in patches. I unzipped and rolled the fabric back, half expecting to find gnats, ants, something awake in the winter, but there was nothing. The hair on my arms stood straight in a band. I gave the skin a brisk rub, and the sensation broke into a scatter of prickles. Static, I thought. Insulation, fibers. I recorded the sensation into the mic and spoke the thought because the act of naming is how you keep going. If any place had the ingredients for that feeling, it was this one. The main building had broken windows high up, and wind rolled through different volumes. Stair towers made slow organs out of the whole place. Down the central spine, tiles were lifted by freeze and time, and where the roof had failed, water had run and dried and run again, leaving the long white salts of summer. In the basement, there had once been a small autopsy room. The papers avoided the word, but the early maps labeled it that way. Late winters when the ground would not open, bodies were stored in the chill. During a strike the year my mother was born, a manager had put up a curtain in a laundry to hide the overflow. A faint gray of ash before breakfast on more than one day. A cemetery of numbered stakes beyond the tray line that sometimes lost its numbers. That was the story of this place when it was alive. The other story, the one that drew people like me, was easier to tell and changed hands at bars and in parking lots. A malevolent presence, not just a long-dead residual echo, but something that grew as more was done, and not done here. At some point the idea of countable souls became a different idea, something cumulative. I never pretend to know what I think about that. I just go where people won't, keep a record, and see what shows up on the tape. The tape started to show something just after midnight by my guess. I had moved through a patient lounge with broken couches and into a classroom where ring binders had emptied themselves across the floor. The blackboard had faint math in a hand that reminded me of my aunt's. I set a static camera on a tripod aimed toward the doorway to the northern hall, and did a slow pan of the room. The thermal noticed nothing but the warm oval of my face reflected in a cabinet window. I clipped a lav mic to a curtain and backed out, trying to make as little sound as possible. When I checked the live feed on the static camera, the doorway looked still and ordinary. I left it rolling. The first auditory anomaly came when I was 3 rooms away. In my headphones, a breath lifted up in the recording chain that I could not match to my own. It was long, narrow, and even like air easing through a small valve. I held my breath and the sound continued. I turned to triangulate. The level bars on the handheld gave me almost nothing, as if the source was close to the lav mic in the classroom instead. I made a note and kept the walk slow. My habit on nights like this is to choose between chasing sounds and holding the path, and I almost always hold the path. When you chase, you run yourself into loops, and loops make it easy to miss the exit. At the end of the northern hall, a stairwell door hung on one hinge. I pushed it with 2 fingers. It grated and then settled without collapsing. The stairs led down to a landing, with a window set at the level of the ground outside. Ice had made a fern on the inside of the glass. I put my fingertips in the hollows of the rail, where paint had worn off between stains of hand oil that would never wash away. The crawling sensation returned, this time a pattern so uniform it felt mechanical. It went from ankle to knee like a row of switches flipping on. I looked down, ready for a literal line of ants, something alive that I could swat or shake, and there was nothing there. I slapped my leg and the feeling paused and then picked up again in the other calf. Either something external was brushing against me from regular intervals in the air, or the body had decided it would translate this quiet into touch. I considered leaving then. The last rule on my list is it is always easier to come back than to stay too long. But the recorder in the classroom had captured something, and I have broken my own rules for less. I went back the way I had come, counting doorways in my head like a schoolchild, one hand out to touch each numbered placard on the jamb for orientation. The field beyond the window, I noticed, was lighter than the halls now, the kind of light a person brings with them. My headlamp pulsed once, the brief dim that signalizes a battery passing some internal threshold. I had charged everything fresh. I told myself I could swap packs in 20 seconds and kept walking. The static camera stood where I had left it, its tally light a small eye. The classroom looked unchanged. My lav mic had slipped on the curtain. It hung by the clip at an angle. I rewound the feed 30 seconds and watched. The doorway stayed a rectangle of darkness, framed by the lighter paint of the hall. Halfway through as I watched, there was a change so small that if you were not watching for hours worth of hours, you would never call it out. A density moved across the doorway like a smudge passing behind frosted glass. I scrubbed backward and forward. On the third pass, I saw that the smudge occluded the corner of a metal desk, in a way that meant it had thickness. I did not see it with my eyes in the room. I saw it on the screen, and the screen says many things we don't want to believe later when we are home. The recorder picked a sound from the hallway, then 3 measured footfalls that faded at the end of the second syllable of my name, as it exists only in my head and not from anyone's mouth. That's projection. That's how a body puts itself into a pattern and makes a sign. I stood still and let the recorder run. I labeled the moment, checked the second camera, and noted a mild jump in the small EM field detector I keep. Not as a proof of anything, but as an instrument you can name without metaphysics. When people ask what you did, in the South Lounge I had to step over a toppled bookcase to get a look at a map, still tacked to the wall. The pins had rusted, threads of red string dangled where someone had once traced something across 3 floors. The sharp pain came back then, quick and exact in the back of my left calf, no wider than a pencil point. It folded my knee for a second. I put a hand against the wall to stay up. I rolled the trouser leg and found only a small reddening where capillaries rise. Air can hurt when it is thin and cold. Electricity can pretend to be an insect. Logic is a balm until it stops working. There was no reason to go lower after that. I turned toward the exit I knew best. Doors feel different when you are leaving. Hinges that squealed when you came in, whisper on the way out. Or you move differently and hear around your own noise. Back through the classroom, past the nurse's station, bearing left at the utility cart, counting the doors to match the numbers I touched on the way in. I put my palm on each one, as if I was clocking out. The crawling sensation did not want to leave. It concentrated itself in the band above my elbows, and moved in little bursts. I shook my arms and tried to laugh to show myself I still knew how. The last hallway back to the south service door felt longer than when I entered. The recorder's levels twitched once for something I could not hear. It could have been a draft, a lift of blanket air on the mic. The tall windows reflected me and then did not reflect me for an instant, and then did. I never trust glass. At the service door, I put my full shoulder into the push bar, and it gave in the same complaint as before. A thin, drawn-out metal mouth. I eased it so the sound did not carry across the field, because there is nothing worse than the thought of someone else stepping through a gap you cut in the night. Outside, the air felt warmer than inside, a winter trick of dry brick, radiating out a low heat it had stored in the day. I breathed. It seemed ridiculous that I had to think about that act. I moved along the fence line, counting paces backward in case I lost the gap. The wire gave with the same crisp sigh as before, when I pulled it aside. At the car, I put the gear down gently and sat on the bumper. It was late but not yet morning. Across the service road, some animal was moving through the grass. A steady draw and release. My hands felt like I had been holding a current for too long, a sleepy tingle that would not let go. I checked the calf again by the dome light and found only the small mark, elevated and already fading. The crawling along my forearm stayed in a thin band and then receded as I watched, like foam sliding back over smooth rock. I closed each case, put gear into its place in the trunk, closed the lid, and with the key in the ignition, looked back at the hulk of the south wing to fix the best line in my head in case I came again. Then I drove toward the sodium lights and the gas station on Grafton Street, where I washed my hands with the rough pink soap by the sink, let the water run until it went hot, and rubbed at a patch of skin that felt for a moment like it remembered being touched by something that was not there. I went because the reports were persistent, not dramatic. A woman seen near the burial ground, night cries, unsettling voices that never quite resolved into words. In my line of work, there's a difference between spectacle and habit. Habit tends to leave a trace. The burial ground sits at the edge of a long, low prairie, where the wind never quite loses its voice. It's fenced with rust-dark wire and cedar posts charred by time. A hand-painted board lists a few surnames, and then a year range that brackets a catastrophe. I had read the rosters in the county archive that afternoon. A winter of shortages, a fever that took the smallest first, then the strongest, then anyone who lingered, a fast arithmetic of grief. The pioneering community hadn't had the luxury of forgetting. They stacked their dead in the ground as quickly as they could open it. By the time I arrived, evening had become simple night. I parked at the rutted turnoff, left my headlights angled away, and followed the faint path to the gate. The stars above were the loud kind, the ones that make the dark feel taller. I kept my kit simple, an audio recorder, a thermocouple, a notebook with stiff rain-swollen pages. I set the recorder on a flat stone inside the fence and clicked it on. The red diode blinked once and settled. The first sound came almost immediately, though I argued with myself about what I'd heard. It was a sob, but spare, like a single drop in a basin. Wind does odd things in these open places. It will find a notch in the fence and shape itself into a syllable. I noted the time 21:13 and circled the interior with slow feet, reading the markers. Some were named, some were only infant. One said mother, 26, and nothing else. The temperature sank a couple of degrees. That happens as the open soil trades its heat with the sky. Nothing inexplicable about it. Still, the air felt like a hand pressing. Not hard, but steady. The crying returned. A little farther off, near the stand of chokecherries beyond the fence. I lifted the recorder, checked its level, felt silly doing so. The sound didn't rise or fall. It simply was, the way a smell is in a house that's been closed for too long. When the voice came, it wasn't a voice in any conversational sense. It was the spine of a voice-unvoiced breath, shaped into almost words. A syllable rode the wind and broke. Another followed. My mind tried to subtitle them. Mara, not there. The guesses felt like an imposition. Something moved along the fence line. Not a coyote, not a deer. The movement had no animal economy to it. It was a standing thing. I kept my light lowered. You preserve night vision and sometimes dignity that way. The form separated from the dark. A woman, or what a mind recognizes as a woman when given a long dress and a low crown of hair. She was thin in the pioneer way, made of work and obligation. She faced inward, toward the markers, not toward me. I have learned not to test such distances quickly. I stood and I breathed. The recorder in my hand registered my pulse. The woman did not move. She was the calm at the center of the crying. I took a step, no more than the length of my boot. The apparition leaned to nothing. There is no better word. It was as if the idea of her were a curtain-catching wind. She thinned, then unraveled, and where she had been there was only a place. It felt indecent to look directly at that spot. But I did. The fence wire there trembled. A small indifferent vibration. I marked the gatepost with a glance to fix the location, and waited. The crying traveled the perimeter like a cautious animal. stopping at corners as if to decide whether to continue. I told myself to catalog, not to conclude. I noted the time again, 21:29, and placed the recorder back on the flat stone, as if proximity mattered to a machine that eats air. You can rationalize a single event out of its singularity. A second event is where habit begins. At 21:37, with no movement of air that I could feel, my left hand went cool as if it had been lifted into shade. The thermocouple didn't show much. A degree maybe, but I've lived inside my body long enough to trust it. The voice scraped the fence wire and almost name, and almost call, and then the low sound of someone trying not to cry at all and failing. I spoke then, because the living also have their habits. I said the names I had found on the markers. I said them the way you say a word you're not sure you have the right to. The wind took them, and for a breath, the crying paused. The pause felt like a shoulder lowering. On the far side of the burial ground, near the cedar post with 2 nails, the form eased back into being, taller now for the angle. She stood as before, attending the place. I watched her without approaching. The instinct to cross the distance is human, but it felt in that moment like stepping into a room where someone is praying. I do not have a rule for what is respectful to the dead, but my body has one, and I let it speak for me. The community that buried their people here had lived through a long subtraction. The records name fevers by the season, by the river they followed, by the way the cough sounded. They speak of blizzards and failed crops and the quiet indecencies of scarcity. All of that took up residence in bodies until the bodies stopped being able to hold it. When grief has nowhere to go, it goes into the ground. When the ground has too much of it, the ground gives it back. I say that now, and it sounds like faith. In the moment it was simpler. There was a woman where there hadn't been a woman, and then there wasn't. There were cries where there shouldn't have been cries, and then there weren't. The recorder blinked its red eye, and would later spit out a wash of sound that I could measure but not correct. On playback, the almost words had more shape than I heard in person. That's a known artifact of recording. Microphones notice what attention filters out. I could lasso fragments. A single name repeated, or the tail of one. The consonants refused to be pinned. It felt like eavesdropping on weather. I did make one approach, finally. Not to the apparition she had retreated again into whichever threshold she obeyed, but to the perimeter of the fence where I had first seen her. The wire there was cold enough that it took a second for my fingers to admit it. A scrap of calico clung to a barb, weathered to the color of ash. I started to reach for it, then stopped. It wasn't a relic. It was simply a piece of cloth someone had snagged in a century of passing, but the urge to pocket it as proof said more about me than the place. I let it be. The unease I carried back to the truck wasn't terror. Terror is bright and conclusive. This was a slower, steadier thing, like a weight that wasn't mine resting on me for a time. I sat with the cab light on and wrote the words I could swear to. Form at fence, dematerializes on approach, crying circling the grounds, unvoiced speech, temperature shift. I wrote the less certain ones too, felt attended, felt intruding. I listed possible natural explanations. Coyotes can sound like human suffering if they want to. Owls can shape the night into vowels. Wind has a voice. My list scrolled on and ran out of road. I went back the next night, and the night after, the pattern held. The sightings and the voices belonged to the after dark hours. The form resolved at a respectful distance. It gave way when I tried to close it. The habit of the haunting was not to be caught, only witnessed. I began to suspect that the distance itself was part of what kept the place in balance. The living kept one side, the dead kept the other, and the fence was not a failure but a promise. On my last night there, I stood at the gate and spoke one more name I had learned from a water-damaged ledger. The crying stopped with the soft astonishment of a held breath, and I felt for the span of a heartbeat something like gratitude pass through the air, the way a cloud shadow passes over grass. Then the wind resumed its work. The recorder blinked, and the burial ground returned to its good ordinary darkness. I left with nothing a courtroom would admit, and everything I had gone for. The consequences of their long winter still lived there, not as revenge or spectacle, but as fidelity. Grief had done what grief does when it has no language. It learned to make one out of weather and wire. All I could do, all any visitor can do, was listen from the proper distance and carry the unease honestly away. I used to joke that the world belongs to the early birds. Night belongs to people like me, those who keep watch when everyone else is asleep. It was a habit that started harmlessly. I'd step onto the back porch after midnight with a mug of coffee, listening to the irrigation lines breathe and the coyotes argue in the far fields. My stepdaughter Lily is a night owl too. Sometimes she'd sit beside me in a blanket burrito, scrolling quietly while the porch light painted our little slice of yard in a cone of gold. The ridge behind our house rose in a dark timbered wall, a silhouette that held the wind. The first time it happened, I mistook it for hail. 3 sharp ticks across the metal roof, and a dry rustle through the laurel leaves. I lifted my face for rain that didn't come. Then a pebble skittered across the top step and clicked against my boot. Lily's blanket stiffened. "What was that?" she whispered. "Probably a squirrel dislodging something," I said, because I'm the adult who explains the world. I nudged the pebble with my toe. It wasn't from our landscaping. The river stones in our beds are flat and gray. This one was rounded like it had been tumbled and spit out, brown and wet with dew. The next night, more hail, not over the whole house, just in a narrow, deliberate sweep across the porch overhang. I killed the light and stood there in the dark, breath fogging, listening. Lily cracked the sliding door and peered out. Another pebble rotated off the edge of the roof and landed on the step between us. Then the ridge exhaled, a single long rolling sound like a metal sheet flexing in a fire. It pushed through my sternum and up my spine, a sound with no animal in it that I knew. Not coyote, not elk, not anything I'd cataloged in a lifetime of living out here. We went back inside and locked the door. Our habit faltered for a week, but sleep and curiosity can be equal tyrants. The porch called us. The night after that, I brought my phone. If there's a sound you can't name, you name it later with tools. At 2:17 a.m., the ridge screamed again. Not like a person, not like anything with a throat arranged the way I expected. It lifted at the end, a drag into a pitch that put heat in my cheeks and made the hair on my arms stand up. Lily was crying quietly, and I hated that I'd let her stay because now I couldn't lie to either of us. I recorded it, hands shaking. We didn't sleep. I sent the audio to a friend who does sound design and field work. He sent it through a spectrogram and overlaid it against a library of wildlife calls. Then he added another layer I didn't ask for, a set of publicly documented recordings of a certain known cryptid. I don't even like saying the name, feels like feeding a story. He wrote back a single line, "Your sample's profile clusters with the Ohio howl and 2 Pacific Northwest calls. Harmonics are weirdly consistent." I didn't show Lily that message. I didn't tell her that when I slowed the file, the shape of the sound, the way it stacked, was a near match to something that shows up in forums and late-night radio. Skeptics don't believe lightly. We believe reluctantly, and only as far as we have to. The pattern set. Our routine had become a signal. Apparently, I shifted the porch light to red to preserve night vision. We sat quiet every few nights, and the ridge answered, sometimes with 1 sustained call, sometimes with 2, a minute apart, bouncing in from slightly different angles like the source moved along the contour line. Other nights, the harassment was more practical. A handful of gravel hissed across the cedar fence. A dry clod of dirt hit the siding and burst like a cough. Small things, thrown from above, landing with intent. "You think someone's pranking us?" Lily asked. I wanted it to be people. People I can explain. People I can call. But there's no direct path to the ridge from our property, and the only access curves in from a fire road half a mile east. Unless someone was crouching in the black timber for hours, in the cold throwing pebbles at our overhang with a pitcher's discipline, there was no straight line to people. I tried something different. The next time the roof chattered, I cut the light and stepped into the yard. Flashlight down. "Hey," I called up into the dark. My voice didn't carry far. "The trees ate it. We hear you. We want you to stop." Silence. Then knock. Not on our house. 2 dry, hollow impacts in quick succession against wood, clean and deliberate like a hammer striking a stump. Knock, knock. A pause, my heart in my throat, and then 3 knocks more, spaced in a way that suggested counting. I found the beam of the flashlight on the back fence, on the shed, on the trees beyond. Nothing. The sound came from high on the slope, too far to shine, too close to mistake. Knock, knock. Knock, knock. Knock, knock. We stood in the stillness after and listened to the yard settle. There is a difference between sound that happens and sound that is made. The porch light hummed back to life. My cup sat cold in my hand. Lily said, "I don't like this." "I know," I said, and wished I had something better. It escalated on a Monday. I know because the schoolbook pile was still on the kitchen table, and tomorrow was a test. Around 1:30 a.m., the first rock hit the gutter. Not a pebble, a rock. It thudded and slid off into the rhododendrons. Another hit the roof properly and rolled until the ridge cap stopped it. Lily flinched hard enough to spill tea, and I took her hand. We moved back from the door. A third clacked against the porch post and dropped onto the landing with a dense, unfriendly sound that said someone. Something had decided to reach farther. I remembered a thing my fieldwork friend said unhelpfully. There are reports of projectile throwing correlated with vocalizations, often from an elevated vantage. It's a behavior. It's a behavior, like nest building or migration, like something alive that does this because it can, and because it wants something from the doing. What does it want? The question felt like the edge of a hole. The scream that followed was the closest yet. It didn't come from the ridgetop, it came from the tree line halfway up the slope, a place where a little volcanic outcrop juts like a shoulder blade. It had an edge to it, a serrated brightness that made my molars ache. Lily pressed her hands to her ears and we both crouched instinctively, making ourselves smaller without meaning to. A beat later came the knocks. 5 hard strikes on wood in a sequence that made no sense, and too much sense at once. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, except the thunder was already inside the house. We didn't go out again that week. I filed a report with the county because that's what you do when you don't know who to call. They sent a deputy who stood in the kitchen and looked politely skeptical and then less polite when I showed him a bowl of stones I'd collected from the roof. Half of them the wrong geology for our yard. He said he'd have someone drive the fire road a couple more times at night. He said to get motion lights, he didn't ask to hear the recording. We put up lights. They triggered on wind and moths, stuttering the yard into fragments. The rocks kept coming. Less frequent but heavier. The knocks happened twice more. Once at 2 a.m. sharp, once at 4:13. The screams, if that's what to call them, settled into a pattern and then broke it, as if the thing that made them had realized we were hearing for pattern, and decided to change the rule. We started sleeping in the front rooms, further from the slope. Neely had a nightmare about teeth. I had a dreamless night that felt like falling through miles of black. The last straw wasn't the loudest night, it was a small thing, the way the worst changes sometimes arrive quietly. We came home late from the grocery store hauling bags, and found the back porch swept clean, not tidied, swept. The bowl of porch pebbles we'd moved inside. A handful was back on the top step, arranged in a little curve like the arc of a smile, or a boundary. Something had come closer in daylight or daylight adjacent, and had what? Marked us, answered our habit. Skeptics aren't brave, we're stubborn. We require a reason to leave, and we were running out of reasons to stay. Lily's safety was the reason that prevailed. We packed with a speed that made our neighbors stare. We told them the ridge was eroding and we were worried about slides. That's not untrue. Dirt moves, and so did we. I left the motion lights up. I left the cedar fence stained and perfect. I left the ridge to keep its secrets, to keep its elevation and its wind. On the last night, waiting for the moving truck in a house that sounded like a mouth after a tooth's been pulled, I took the phone into the empty kitchen and played the recording one more time. The spectrogram means nothing if you don't feel it, and I wanted to make sure I hadn't conjured it, that the sound did what it did. It did. The harmonics climbed and fanned like a hand opening, the foreman stacking into a geometry the human voice doesn't love. It matched the library my friend used. It matched the nights I can't undo. It matched the shape of fear that turns a habit into a signal and a home into a place you leave. We drove away before midnight. because I couldn't stand to acknowledge the hour we'd made significant. Lily slept with her headphones on, blanketed and small, the highway unspooling in front of us like a promise. In the rear view, the ridge was a black shape against the stars, tall and unchanged. Maybe it never noticed us at all. Maybe we were just noise it answered with noise, a call and response across a stretch of dark. None of us own. Either way, we were gone. We gave night back to itself, and in the quiet that followed, the world belonged again to the birds. I pack the same way, whether it is for work or a weekend. Tools first, then food, then sleep. Ratchet straps pulled flat, lid on the cooler press fit so it does not burp on washboard. Headlamp, batteries checked against my palm by weight. I like when things tell the truth by how they feel. On the drive up from US 101 outside Forks, the truck spoke in that steady highway rhythm, and I caught myself cataloging a faint rattle near the dash, as if I were about to pull it apart on a job site. We were after a rumor, an old logging yard out a spur road where the forest had taken back most of what men left. It was the sort of plan that scratches the same itch as fixing something. Find the thing, see what it is, leave with a clear picture of how it all used to work. There were 4 of us. I was the one who kept the trips on time, a habit from a life of commercial work where other people's schedules ride your back. My friends called me level whenever a decision came up. We camped on a flat off a tight bend where cedar duff had piled so deep my boots left neat shallow prints. The clearing held just enough sky to see the lateness. We set the tent, pulled the tailgate down, and let the last heat of the day come off the bed of the truck. It felt like any other Friday night setup, stove clinking, a cheap folding table that never quite locked square, the quiet satisfaction of the cooler finally iced into place. Someone had pinned the rumor on a paper map before we left town. An X scrawled near where the spur line petered out into green. A decommissioned yard. We figured rusted equipment. A shack with a few nails left in it. Some graffiti. I had built a picture of gray and orange, and sap-logged wood. That was the expectation we carried, as dusk folded over us and the forest edited itself down to silhouettes. The first sound came like someone turning on a machine we already knew. Not a single crack or distant shout, a full tone. The kind a motor throws when it is warmed and under load. It was not loud. It was distinct. The way a voice is distinct when it says your name in a room of other voices. A thin, high mechanical note rose, held and sloped. The way a saw does when it bites, then eases. Under it came a lower cycling thrum that suggested belts or chain. It did something to my chest. Not fear. Not yet. Recognition. The working part of my mind started drawing a diagram over the trees. We each looked to the same edge of the dark where the road bent away. In trade work, sound tells you everything if you listen. This was a machine running steady. Then, layered on top, the staccato rhythm of something heavy meeting wood with intent. A knock and follow through like a carriage stop or a loader, setting down a log. It organized into a pattern, then blurred again when the wind shifted, and scattered across it, carried strangely far in the cool air. Came human voices, not words I could lift. Calls and replies shaped like we knew how to fit a job to a time. The way you hear a crew when you cannot see the site. We ate standing up, like we might be called to move. None of us said the obvious. When you live around tools, your ears are your first test. The noises did not drift into natural sounds. They were not mistaken owls or river. It was work noise. It ran long enough that we found ourselves relaxing into the idea that there was an active cut nearby, just over the ridge, one of those outfits that use a narrow window to get a haul done. It was not our business. When the drone shifted and what might have been a voice carried a sharp edge, the hairs on my arm rose before my mind caught up. I closed the tailgate as if that would tidy the night. We slept in fits, not from fear so much as from the problem of it being both ordinary and not. Around midnight, the sound settled, and the forest returned to itself. The silence after constant noise takes a minute to trust. I woke once to drink water and listen. Nothing. No motors, no calls, just the creak of branches and the soft adjustment of a tent wall in a breeze. I let that normalcy press me back into sleep, and when dawn steeped the clearing to a muted gray, The usual joy of coffee and a day ahead returned like it always does. When you plan a look-see, you do it in daylight. That is how we went. We followed the spur road as it thinned and turned from gravel to packed dirt, to 2 tracks with grass up the middle. The rumored yard showed itself as a widening, a space cleared years ago and then abandoned to time. The structures that remained leaned in on themselves. A shack with a metal roof collapsed inward, a long, low platform where you could imagine lengths of timber once stacked, now held ferns. The air was damp with the smell of cedar and iron, nails pushed out of old boards like teeth. We moved without hurry, each of us taking in the same scene from different angles. For me, it was hardware, an iron pulley with its wheel frozen in place, a length of chain embedded in bark, where a sapling had grown huge. An old log scribe wooden handle smoothed by hands, its metal point scaled with a fur of rust lay among the litter, and someone long ago had carved initials into the handle in a small tidy hand. It was the only piece with any grace to it. Everything else was simple and hard, and now useless. What struck was what was not there. No fresh tracks, no fuel smells thin tartness, no chips bright enough to be recent. The ground told you a story of seasons layered on seasons, not days. Where men work, they leave signs you cannot miss, no matter how careful they are. There were none. The shack's floor was slick where damp had had its way. We walked the perimeter, and then stood where the open space narrowed back into trees, and I tried to fit last night's sounds to what lay quiet in front of us. My mind ran through explanations. Maybe a crew was further out than we thought. Maybe the noise had carried along the softened air and tricked our distance sense. Reason can be a balm when you need to take the next step. We returned to camp in that calm day way, the sun at our backs, and the ground a little springy underfoot. If it had ended there, the yard would have been a quirky memory, a place we found and measured with our eyes, one more notch in the stories you tell about the weekend. But as afternoon leaned toward evening, a tremor of that same high mechanical tone pricked the edge of hearing again. The first note of a song you know. The difference this time was how it seemed to start without any lead-in, like someone lifted a fader in a studio, and the work just was. I felt tired, more than nervous, the way you feel when a neighbor starts up a job after dinner, and you know your night is going to be shaped by it. The sun sank, and the pattern built up. There was the rising and falling saw tone, then the lower belt hum, then the heavy impacts in a rhythm that made no sense with the silent day we had walked. The voices came too, like calls traded across a yard. If you have ever worked where people know what they are doing, you can hear the difference between chaos and order. This had order. It was deliberate. All of that action existed at a distance that refused to settle, with the trees right there and the road curling out of sight. The sound felt both a quarter-mile away and pressed right against us. We did not light a big fire. After dark, flame can blind you to what is beyond its edge. We ate simply. I tightened belt straps I had no need to tighten. My hands like doing when my head cannot fix a thing. A smell like hot metal drifted through, as if it had lifted straight from a blade under load. It did not belong to the evening cool in the trees. It made the wind feel wrong on my face. "Let's pack," someone said, voice made steady for the group. We were already deciding in our bodies before we named it. You do not have to wait for trouble to walk straight into you to walk away. We broke camp with a quiet that was not courtesy to the forest, so much as a habit learned from being near moving equipment. Coils of rope back in a bin, stove folded, sleeping pads rolled and strapped. I reached for my pack and froze. The zipper teeth along the top were split and curled back like something had pried into it with patience instead of force. Inside, my clothes were churned out of their neat stacks and scattered. My work gloves, my good ones, broken and just so, were laid palm to palm, fingers aligned, as if someone had matched them with care. The knife I keep clipped in a front pocket was not where I leave it. Later, when I circled the truck to check the tires before we moved, I found the knife's clip peeking from a perfect slit in the rubber cover of the spare. Blade inserted just enough to show it had been placed, not dropped. All around our camp, small wrongs stood up like flags, a bootlace cut clean through, and the ends arranged on the tailgate. A canteen opened and poured into a folded jacket, as if the person doing it wanted the water to go nowhere but into that one pocket. The mat from the glove box taken out and folded to a blank space, so that the X we had marked the day before did not show. It was not raccoons or wind. It was attention aimed specifically at us. Targeted, the energy in my chest that had been analysis all weekend turned to something harder. Not panic. A flat, clear line. Leave now. Under that awareness, the work sounds pressed on, unchanged in tone, unchanged in order. It made a strange counterpoint, like the wrong reality was the louder one, and then the thing that tipped it from violated to cold came into view. In the very center of where we had been sitting, a circle of disturbed duff where the 4 camp chairs had made their print, sat the log scribe from the yard. Not similar, the same, the wooden handle with the initials carved into it in that tidy hand, the point pitted and scaled, clean of debris as if it had been tended to. It had not been in our camp before. It had been buried in leaves. 30 minutes walk up the spur, we had not taken it. Nobody had laughed and tossed it in the truck. We stood arranged around it without speaking. I know how people move through space and leave signs. I know the pattern of a prank and the pattern of a warning, and the pattern of a job gone long. None of those fit what was earthed in the duff between us. The sound of work we could not see continued to grind on against the dark. The old tool lay ready like a neat set of instructions from a different time. We picked up what we could without method. The tent went into the bed in a damp ball. The stove and table clattered into bins. I held the log scribe without meaning to, just a second, and its weight was less than I expected. The wooden handle polished to the feel of hands that were not mine. I put it back where it had been placed. That felt like the only courtesy left to us. Engines are honest. When I turned the key, my truck answered with the same reliable start it always gives. The headlamps cut a clean cone through the cedar trunks. The moment my foot found the brake, the work tone seemed to swell as if to meet us. We did not drive fast. The road did not allow for it, and speed would have been a kind of admission to something I did not want to admit. We made our way back to US 101, like people who know how to leave without dragging the problem along. The noises faded the way they had begun, as if someone had rolled them down with a hand on a switch. The forest held itself quiet and straight-faced, indifferent to whether we believed what we had heard. By the time the highway shoulders opened out and the line paint flashed under the tires, normal life had slotted back around us so cleanly that for a beat I questioned whether I had overread it, whether the day and the night had been 2 separate stories overlaid. I did not mention the initials on the handle to my friends until days later. It felt like holding an address and not being sure whether you wanted to know if it still existed. At work that week, a belt squalled on a rooftop unit, and for a second I felt night air in my lungs and the peculiar pressure of a machine running where it could not be. I put my hand to the casing like I always do and counted heartbeats in the vibration. The unit settled under my palm. The ordinary is a balm. Most days it sticks. Some nights the brain that loves a good diagram will start to sketch a yard in the trees where the workers never clock out and the job never ends. And I will think about an old tool set precisely where we were going to put our feet. That small deliberate touch, and how a sound can make space in your head where no thing stands at all. I took the later rounds because the building behaved differently after midnight. The elevators moved slower, the motion sensors blinked at their own pace, and the new fire panel in the lobby displayed a steady green that never settled me. The place was in conversion, half office suites with glass walls and fresh carpet, half corridors that wrinkled into old tile and paint that remembered older hands. I walked with a ring of keys against my hip, and a flashlight that was heavier than it looked, and I made a habit of counting the push bars on doors as I passed them, even when I didn't write it down. The complex sits just off East Colfax Avenue where the traffic never sleeps. We call it a municipal health campus because that's less of a story than what it used to be. I learned the old name the first week by accident, paging through a binder in the security office while the camera cycled. The binder was part safety plan, part archive, and someone had slipped photocopies into the back. State investigations, depositions, a fire marshal's report bound with a rusted staple. The phrasing was formal and brittle. Pattern of staff-inflicted harm. Seclusion room practices. Fatalities attributable to smoke inhalation following internal fire. I had been in buildings with bad stories before, but those sentences landed like hardware. cold, practical, meant to hold something heavy in place. The day staff treat the past like a rumor that leaked into daylight. They point at potential and talk about grant cycles. The tours come through on weekends, soft voice developers showing off renderings. There's a note taped inside the security desk drawer. Visitor complaint log. Smoke odors. Explain no active fire. It is crisp typed laminated. I didn't think much of it until I started hearing it from people who had no reason to invent a smell. They would come back down the stairs with their coats unzipped and say they had caught a whiff of a campfire in a conference room with no windows, or a hallway that had never been modernized. Now and then someone would offer the attribution before we could. Must be the place remembering, must be them. We never wrote that part on any form. My rounds began in the same pattern every night. I checked the exterior doors, then the first floor east wing where the glass walls foxed my reflection into a man who moved with purpose. Past the vending machines, past the custodial closet with the mop heads hung like gray marsh grass. I tested the stairwell door at the back, an old steel slab with a push bar that had been replaced so many times the screws looked enlarged in their sockets. I made sure the magnet engaged when it swung shut. I said the sequence in my head as if it were a prayer. Mechanical close, catch, magnetic draw, green light. Things meant to contain things. I used to do private investigations that kept me in a car on the edge of light for 8 or 10 hours at a stretch. My body learned the shape of watchfulness, shoulders easy, eyes busy, breath slow. I brought that with me into this job because it's the only thing I own that still feels expensive. You get careless at 3 in the morning and forget one door, and the place will remind you that it has more entrances than you can hold in your head. Most nights the building only asked to be seen. A flicker in an unrenovated wing where a ballast hadn't been changed. An hour later, the scent of floor polish blooming up out of nowhere, because the heat cut in and pushed old air out of a closet. But the smoke was different. You didn't see it. You smelled it only long enough to know you had smelled it. It was never even the same kind of smoke. Once it was pine, clean and outdoor. Once it was paper left too long in a toaster oven. Once it was a wool sweater held close to a candle. I started to keep a private list. I never wrote it down. The sub-basement wasn't on my official route. Facilities would bring up spare chairs from storage, and the contractor crews kept their compressors down there for a while. But by winter it had gone quiet. The third week I worked nights. One of the maintenance guys told me that the oldest part of the campus connected under the new part with a service corridor. Think of it like a utility artery, he said, waving his hand. I did, and I also thought a chamber nobody asks about until something bleeds through. If you take the southwest stairwell all the way down past where the lights change color, you hit a landing with concrete walls and no signage. There's a badge reader beside a metal door set into the wall. The reader isn't hooked up anymore, but the door still operates on an old push-to-exit bar that feels like a gymnasium memory. The first time I found it, I stood there and listened. There's a pressure change when you open a door to a space that holds itself. You can hear your own breathing flatten as if it's been invited to match a tempo. I talked myself into checking it after the cameras flashed a motion alert in the inner basement at 1 in the morning. The footage showed nothing but static, and the lazy white loop of a dust particle wandering near the lens. On the way down, the air cooled, in the way that makes your skin acknowledge square footage. I pressed the bar, felt the rubber pad cave under my palm, and the door moved as if it had been waiting at a polite distance. The hinges made a damp, controlled sound, like something once slick now dry. Inside, the light was industrial and spare. The corridor ran left and right, and the walls were a kind of painted cinder block that always makes conversation carry. I went left because that was the side where the ceiling hung lower, threaded with conduits that held ridged gray tubing and copper lines. My flashlight picked up markers every few feet, labeled with tidy letters and numbers that would have meant something to a building engineer. There were damp prints on the floor that I decided belonged to someone's boot a day earlier, although I could not see the edges clearly enough to swear it. Beyond that, the floor was clean in the way that makes you wary of what it might hide if given a chance. I could smell a thing before I named it. It lifted at me in a small current, thin and specific, not wood, not electrical, something sweeter and more chemical, like powdered latex gloves warmed by skin. Inside that sweetness, a smoke that wasn't in the air so much as in the idea of the air, caught not in the lungs but in the top of the mouth. The kind of smell you have to open your jaw slightly to admit. It moved past me, and did not move past me. I have never been good at describing this part without sounding like someone asking to be believed. You become a guard and an investigator for the same reason. Rules feel like handholds. You get to say, I did this because the list said to do it, and if something happens, the list is there to catch it. I made myself move on account. Left glove to the wall, right hand on the flashlight, eyes ahead, and then quick back. Counts keep other thoughts out. At the end of the corridor, a smaller door opened into a chamber that didn't belong to any era I could date. It held old and new in a way that made both more strange. Metal shelves along one wall held pallets of supplies nobody had inventoried in a while. Folded cotton sheets in thick plastic, boxes of plastic water pitchers, a crate of unassembled wire baskets. Along the opposite wall, there was a unit that looked like a relic of an older distribution system. Metal chutes with hinged doors, each labeled in the kind of all caps that used to be a job. In the middle of the room stood 2 rolling gurneys with their rails up, parked like someone had stepped away mid-task. The light overhead hummed in a steady way, and when I listened harder, I realized the hum layered with something faint and intermittent, a sound like a breath that didn't know if it was coming from inside or outside the wall. The smell of smoke landed again, and sharpened to something charred and human adjacent, and then subsided as if it had passed through an invisible filter. I steadied my breath. I reminded myself of new paint, of vents, of how buildings exhale at night. They were there, and then they were there. That's how I had to tell it after. 2 women in white, but not the white I know from modern scrubs. The white of uniforms that turned gray in the wash and still passed inspection. One stood nearer the gurneys and the other nearer the chutes. Their hair was pulled back in ways that wanted to be clean more than they wanted to be neat. There was no drama to their arrival. They belonged to the room in an unadorned way, like labels that had been under the plastic the whole time. I knew what I was looking at, and I didn't know. The words lined up on their own. Medical staff, nurses. I didn't take a step forward or back. My pulse rose in that quick, shallow way that lets the mind move faster, and I noticed irregular details because the rest of me could not decide how not to panic. The hem of one uniform was uneven, as if it had been mended by a left-handed person. The other wore shoes I couldn't place. Not flats, not sneakers. Something leather with a strap across the top. Both held their hands like they were used to having them full. Neither looked at me at first. They moved around me the way colleagues move around a new hire who hasn't yet gone through orientation. I think they spoke to each other before either of them took me in. Their voices didn't arrive as sound so much as structure. Words that placed themselves into the room without asking our ears permission. They were neither warm nor cold. They lived in the middle where work lives. I caught the second half of a sentence and then the first half of one, like a radio between stations that decides to be generous for a moment. We chart it, and they tell us to rechart. Doors open from the inside. It's not supposed to be like that. Count again. Count again. When the nearer one finally turned her face toward me, her expression kept doing what it had been doing. It didn't change into recognition or warning. It didn't even show irritation that I had been in the room without a mask, or a badge that matched theirs. She looked the way you look at a noise that might be a machine completing a cycle. When she addressed me, I felt my spine accept what my mind refused to. It was the way someone asks something that matters and expects the answer to matter. Is it out? I don't remember what I said back. I've told it both ways and neither feels precise. I might have told her everything was clear. I might have said I didn't smell it anymore. I might have said yes because yes is what a person says when they have nothing else. The other woman had come around the gurneys and stopped at the unit of metal chutes. She lifted one of the small doors with the back of her hand and let it fall back slowly as if each hinge might be counted as it returned. "We did what we were told," she said. "We did what we could." Not apology, not a defense, simply the record. The words set down in the air with a weight that didn't require me to hold any of it up. I have had my eyes tricked by reflections before. Windows will make you think a light down a hall is someone standing where no one can stand. Even the good cameras generate shapes from static that a tired brain will fill in with a person-sized conclusion. This wasn't that. This was 2 presences with the kind of fidelity that could teach you the stitching on a sleeve. If they had been an intruder and her friend, I would have reached for my radio and then my phone, called it in and stayed between them and the door. You play out the move. You raise your voice. You follow policy. You keep your hands visible. You make sure nothing metal appears that needs to be named. None of that applied. I felt my body trying to align with training and my training sliding off like a magnet losing interest. The smell deepened and then turned in place. It came from nowhere I could target with a hose or a call to facilities. It had no edges. It felt like heat without warmth. The nearer woman, if I keep calling her that, it's because I am trying not to make it more precise than it was, put her hand flat on the nearest gurney rail, as if to steady a cart going through a doorway. The other let one of the chute doors hang open, and then guided it back down without sound. They stood inside a moment, so full of work that I had to meet it with mine. I made myself look at their faces and tell myself exactly what I saw. Skin that held light like anyone's. Eyes that did not share a color with me or anyone I know. Lines of fatigue that made them ageless in the way tired people all share. Is it out? The nearer one asked again. The exact same construction. Patient only the way habit makes you patient. There are rooms where a question repeats for a reason. It tests the system. It makes sure the next step is allowed. In the binder upstairs, in the copied testimony that I had stopped reading because I wanted to sleep like a person who had never worked in a building with a sub-basement, one of the phrases recurred in different mouths. Count again. Verify. Lock it from the outside so it can be opened from the inside. Somebody has to write the sequence to reclaim what happened. The smoke had been attributed by visitors, by staff who lowered their voices, by internet threads attached to articles with no pictures, to those who died here in the fire, that moved through an internal ward faster than anyone had written a plan for. The staff violence was documented years before, and some of the same names appear across the investigations, and if you line all that up, your body tries to make a reason. But reasons don't help you when the door under your hand decides it is part of a larger statement. I didn't answer the second time. I understood that my answer had nothing to do with what she would do next. The light steadied and then hiccuped in a way no bulb actually did. Or maybe it did, and I finally noticed the way a ballast whispers when it wants to be replaced. The sound threaded through the room pivoted into something like a distant measured exhale, and then the air smoothed itself as if a hand had passed over cloth. The nearer woman let go of the rail. The other stepped back from the chutes. They didn't disappear in any theatrical way. They took a step that made them congruent with a set of angles I hadn't recognized, and then the room allowed only one reading again. I stood still until my breath was something I could carry upstairs without dropping. I left the gurneys where they were. I closed my flashlight hand to test the tremor, and let it shake until it had done what it came to do. The door out of the chamber weighed the same as before, and yet I had to set myself behind it like a person moving a piano, an inch to the left. In the corridor, the smell thinned to the suggestion of an extinguished match. At the stair, I let the door settle and watched the latch complete its work. Mechanical close, catch, magnetic draw, green light. On my way back through the first floor, the building looked newly staged. The chairs in the waiting area were too bold, the water fountain too shiny, my shadow too specifically mine. The fire panel was still green. I signed the log and wrote nothing out of respect for whatever upstairs language lives between policy and folklore. In the morning, the day shift always shoots me a look that asks if anything happened, and hopes for no. I gave them the version that keeps a place employed. Alarm fine, all clear. After my shift ended, I walked out to East Colfax and let the early traffic turn the air into something human again. The sky had that Denver winter color that refuses to choose a tone. The diner on the corner was already open. I stood there with my hands inside my jacket and let a faint smell of smoke arrive from somewhere that made sense. A kitchen, a cook on a grill, toast pushed a minute too far, and I let the street claim it. I told myself the questions inside the building were somebody else's archive now. Then a small draft came up from the stairwell grate and brought a different version, and my body, traitor and instrument both, recognized it before my head did. By the time the switchbacks narrowed to a goat's trail and the pines thinned into black silhouettes, I'd already misjudged the weather twice. The forecast had promised a clear night and 10 more miles to the ridge. What arrived instead was a sky that collapsed without preamble. Wind unspooled from the ravine. The temperature fell like a trapdoor, and rain came on in hard metallic sheets that turned the granite slick under my boots. Night folded itself over the mountains so quickly it felt personal. I love that sensation of being a small, moving piece of a living map. It's why I hike alone, why I talk to the trees without believing they answer. Spiritual, sure. Skeptical, always. I know enough about the Alpine to trust that when the storm decides to take your measure after dark, your biggest virtue is finding cover. There was none. No campsite, no cave. Just wind-sheared rock and roots like ribs. The beam of my headlamp skittered over rain and lichen, and ended on an opening in the brush. I swear I hadn't seen on the climb up. A path that cut away from the main trail at a neat angle, narrow and tamped smooth by feet I couldn't imagine. It felt reckless to trust it, and ridiculous not to. Lightning stitched the ridge. I ducked onto the new path. The wind flattened at once, as though I'd stepped into a different weather. The trees closed in, alder replacing pine. The air warmed by a fraction that felt like a blessing. The path smoothed again after a short, steep pitch, and then it appeared a small building with a single dark window and a belfry that leaned like a tired shoulder. No sign, no fence, just a chapel or something like one, set into a shallow shelf of stone, its paint peeled down to the grain. If it had been daytime, I might have circled it first. As it was, the rain intensified against the roof in a single roar, and the door took my weight with surprise. Inside, the scent of wet wood and old dust replaced the cold tang of rain. I turned off my headlamp. Even in the dark, the room held together, an aisle between two rows of benches, a low altar at the far end, a window to my left with imperfect glass. In a different storm, with a different life, I might have eased down on a bench and let the roof drum me to sleep. I clicked the headlamp on, weak and yellow against the space, and saw the art. The walls were crowded, every span of wood bearing reliefs and paintings. They were not obscene or grotesque. They were just wrong in a way that made my eyes want to form a new grammar. Halos backed away from the heads they were supposed to crown, hanging like moons shifting slightly out of orbit. Hands, many of them, not too many, but placed where no hand should be. In the space between shoulder blades, along a forearm, a single extra thumb set at a wrist like a knot. Faces were featured but misregistered, as if the paint had been laid from a memory that wouldn't sit still. Mouths where mouths belonged, yet the lips were the wrong shape to form an amen. Eyes placed cleanly but focused a degree past me, as if something better were hovering over my other shoulder. The altar carried a triptych. In the central panel, a figure I would have called a saint, if the robe hadn't been cut like a hiking parka. The hood pulled around a face that was neither male nor female, and both. The side panels tried to mirror the central image but didn't, each one off by a countable difference. A finger absent in one, a vine that twisted toward the floor instead of the sky in the other. I felt my skepticism clamp down around my spine like a brace. It wasn't fear, it was misalignment. The room's center of gravity had slid a half-inch to the left and taken me with it. To ground myself, I stepped to the window. Raindrops stitched a lattice across its old glass, warping the night. I'd beyond. The slope should have fallen away toward the canyon. It did, but not where it belonged. It was as if the view had been lifted and set back down 2 paces to the right. The tree line marched true. The ridge held its teeth against the sky. But the angles were wrong. The kind of wrong that makes you think of a crooked horizon, and the sea slopping out of its basin. I shifted my weight, expecting the parallax to correct. It didn't. The window's frame held a different exterior than the door had a moment earlier. I turned the headlamp off, and for a breath the displacement disappeared. Turn it on, and the world outside the window slid back into the wrong place. I don't pretend to know what that means. I only know the relief and the frustration fought inside me like hounds. And then, there came singing. I knew it before I admitted I did. The tune came thin and distant, too many throats for the lonely hill I stood on, woven with the uniformity only a congregation can pull off. The same pauses, the same swell at the same syllable. The hymn was one my grandmother used to hum while she cooked. All things bright and beautiful, except this wasn't that. It kept stepping one note lower at the end of each line, turning the promise into its minor key shadow. The words weren't in English or in anything I'd learned, but the cadence trailed a rhyme my childhood recognized and walked it backwards. I pressed my palm to the window. The glass was warm as if someone had held their own hand there an hour ago. The singing did not move closer. It didn't move at all. It occupied a fixed column of air somewhere past the ridge and inside the room at the same time, and both of those are impossible. I never saw a person. I never saw a light. There's a bargain hikers make with all their private gods after dark. If the trail is safe, I will not make meaning where there is none. I stood in that room, listening to the familiar turn unfamiliar, watching the outside slide sideways inside the window frame, surrounded by art that almost knew me, and I felt comfort and confusion braid together until my breath stumbled. I called out once, hello, a word I expected to embarrass me. The sound died into the wood. In the beam of my headlamp, something over the altar shivered. Not moved. Shivered, as a heat shimmer does above asphalt. A vertical wavering that pinched the air. The triptych's central panel seemed to go deeper for a second, like looking down a well. The saint's hood darkened at the edges, and the wrong halo sharpened, a constellation tightening. I had enough of me left to be practical. I should dry out, I should sleep, I should wait until the storm quit. But instinct belongs to older agreements. I was already backing away, my heel knocking against a bench, the beam of my lamp scattering across the aisle. The singing thinned, or I did. The air at the door held the thickness of a curtain, and passing through it was like slipping into a different altitude again. Pressure eased, heat drained. Rain slapped my face with glad hands. Outside, the path accepted my boots without complaint, and the brush parted. Behind me, I didn't look back at the window, or the wrong world it held. The chapel shrank to a dull square, then to a suggestion, then to a slick of shadow. When I reached the main trail, the storm began to unravel, not stop but lighten. Ropes of rain fraying into mist as if they'd remembered themselves and loosened. I walked until the slope folded me into a stand of pines and sat under their dripping crowns until my pulse came home. In the morning, after a tired stumble back to the trailhead, I told myself it had been a nervous shelter in a storm. I drove to the ranger station to log a note. An unmarked structure up by Alder Split. Someone should check the integrity. The ranger, a woman with hair the black of raven's wings, tapped keys, hummed a bar from a song I almost knew, and frowned at her screen. There was no structure. Not on the maps. Not on the last inspection reports. Not in the set of scanned surveys that go back a century. She looked up and said, "Lots of old claims up there. Miners built odd things." Her tone made it a kindness, but our eyes didn't meet exactly, as if hers were looking a degree to my right. I went home and did what those of us who trust systems do. I checked USGS layers. I combed local history forums. I found a 1940s photograph of a different valley in a chapel where it shouldn't be, that had nothing to do with my mountain. I listened to hymns my grandmother might have known, and none of them were the one I heard, until I played one in a minor key and felt my teeth ache. Weeks later, hiking the same ridge in full sunlight, I looked for the cut in the brush. The storm had stripped a lot of leaves, and the afternoon made every pine needle a small spear of gold. The main trail was where it always is. The path that had saved me wasn't. I walked the length of that section twice, slow, testing every shadow as if the mountain might be hiding a door in the bushes for me out of a sense of humor. There was nothing to find. The ground where the chapel had stood, if it had, was full of lupine and fox tracks. The window that showed the world wrong was only sky. I was safe. I could say that and mean it. My body came home uninjured, my pack lighter by a few calories and a little nerve. But some part of my mind never left that room. It lives now in the half-inch slide between what is and what almost is, adjusting itself every time a window shows me my own reflection, slightly displaced. If there's a name for what happened, I haven't found it in any official record. I know only the fact of a storm, the mercy of a roof at the right moment, a congregation I didn't see singing a hymn I nearly knew, and a chapel that wasn't there when I went back to thank it. I don't ask more from the mountain than it offers. but I carry the offering like a splinter, small, persistent, and impossible to forget. I took the kitchen trash out to the alley after the late news, barefoot on the back steps, expecting the same rush of cool air that comes every night when the swamp cooler finally winds down. The bag bumped my shin. The porch bulb carved a small circle against the dark yard, pale across the dust of early fall. The screen door didn't catch when I came back in. It rocked once, lazy on the hinge, and clicked open again against the jamb. I noticed right away that the kitchen felt too quiet for the hour, and for my house. The little habits of a pet turn into background noise, and when they go silent, you feel it in your ribs before your ears. I called for Maple, without thinking, the way you call into a habit. Maple was my cat Ginger, with a white down chin and a habit of getting underfoot when I tied my shoes. If I had to carry laundry, Maple turned it into a game. A pounce on shadows, a swipe at a stray sock, a routine. The empty floor where he usually threaded around my ankles felt like a subtraction. I swept the flashlight off the hook by the back door, because that's the next part of the routine when you own a curious animal. The screen had opened against the jamb. I told myself he hadn't gone far. The alley could wait. I slipped on a pair of sneakers without socks, flicked the lock to keep the screen from swinging, then clicked it open again when guilt nudged me that he'd need a way back in if I scared him away from a bush. I started in the yard, kneeling at the tangle under the lilacs where Maple liked to press his belly against the cool dirt. He wasn't there. I checked the low space under the deck with the flashlight, sweeping the beam over the cross braces. The light made the cobwebs sparkle, and then they were just web again when I moved on. The neighbors had a motion sensor that hummed awake and put gold on their fence slats. Somewhere, a car idled 2 streets over, and then drove off. It was quiet enough to hear the intersection signal at Mulberry and Shields make its little electrical click before the light changed. You'd think I'd know better by now. You mean to fall asleep on time. You mean to keep the cat in. You mean and then you do. Because a trash bag needs tying and it's easier to take it out right then. One small thing opens another, like the screen finding its way back off the latch. I told myself I'd circle the block and be done. Fort Collins has a way of holding its breath after midnight. The tall cottonwoods by City Park lean in on the side streets, and the porch lights make little rooms of their own out on the sidewalk. I walked south on Bryan toward the park, then cut over a block to where West Mulberry runs long and straight. My flashlight felt brighter there, throwing a white path across lawns gone already to do. Maple had a red collar that sometimes caught the beam and flashed back like an eye. I listened for the light scrabble of claws on concrete, the chirp he made when he spotted me. I walked and called, soft, so I wouldn't wake anybody who didn't need to know my business. Maple, come buddy. No answer. The smell of damp leaves rose off a neighbor's bin, and somewhere a sprinkler tossed its small metronome against the base of a shrub. I turned the beam toward hedges and under the low cut of parked cars. Headlights drifted along Mulberry and were gone. The city wasn't asleep exactly, just turned sideways watching itself. I paused at the corner by the little apartment building across from the park. There's a street lamp there that goes a bit sour toward the end of the summer, tinged to something like tea. The light made a weak puddle on the concrete and left everything beyond it darker by contrast. I kept my voice low. Maple. Behind me, wind worked the elm leaves. The sound rubbed the air like fingers along a table. Not quite a whistle, not quite a hush. I tightened my grip on the flashlight because I realized I had no pockets and nothing else to do with my hands. The first time I thought I saw it because I wanted to see my cat. The beam took a path along the sidewalk toward the small strip of grass by the curb, then into the darker stripe beyond the lamp, and something passed through that glow. It was small and upright, about as high as a child might be but wrong in proportion. Its stride was compact, the feet placed with a kind of exactness that made it look older than small. Its silhouette didn't spread where you'd expect shoulders. It was narrow, a column cut from the dark with something like arms close to the sides, as if it were carrying its own elbows. I didn't swing the flashlight directly at it because I have a habit of not blinding whatever I'm looking for, whether it's a cat or a possum, or a neighbor who might turn and be startled to find someone aiming a light right into their evening. So I skimmed the edge of the beam across the figure's path, a sliver of brightness like a second hand on a quiet wall. In that slice, I should have seen details. Denim, skin, a face turning. What I saw was not that. The strip of light seemed to pass through it as if the beam were thinner there, as if the air were thicker where it walked. The halo around the bulb filled out on one side of it, slimmed unexpectedly on the other. The silhouette stayed intact. It didn't flinch, it continued. The exactness of its steps unchanged, heading from the shadow of a maple tree toward the strip of grass, one measured pace after another. The sound around me didn't change. The sprinkler kept its slow tap. My breath made a shallow cloud in the cooler air. "Hey," I said without meaning to. "Wait." It didn't wait. It didn't speed up. It didn't do anything that acknowledged me. I stood there, more aware of the way my heart took 2 extra steps before it settled. I'll move the flashlight, wider this time, still avoiding the core of the beam. The figure entered the edge of the lamp's puddle of light, and did not grow more distinct. If anything, it grew simpler. The places where a person would have had texture flattened into plainness. I don't know what I expected. A face, a hood, a dog pulled on a leash, a kid in a dark jacket who would turn and say something sideways about being out late. The figure reached the very center of the light and stepped into it. That's where something in me went still. It didn't duck into a driveway or jump a curb. It didn't crowd against a parked car. It didn't slip behind a tree. There was no behind. It stepped. It thinned. The edges of its outline feathered, then brightened like heat above asphalt, as if the night had been folded along a seam and pressed flat in that exact place. I saw the concrete through the middle of it, not around it, but inside the shape where a torso would have been. And then the grass beyond showed, pale blades with dew clinging, and then those small details were simply all there was. The figure was gone, not running, not in the hedge, just not. I didn't realize I'd let the flashlight droop until the cat treats in my left hand shifted and rustled against the bag and made me jump at myself. The beam fell across my shoes, then the curb, then finally back up to the lamp, and there was nothing to see but a circle of light on a sidewalk with a crack running through it, like a long thin river. The particular hum of that lamp, always a touch lower than the one on the next block, filed itself into my ear as if it had been there all my life and I'd never remarked on it. I moved forward a little, because what else was I supposed to do? I touched the place where the figure had stepped, and felt nothing but concrete cool from the night. I half expected to feel a static snap in my fingers, a charge, but there was no electricity loose in that patch. The city made the same low sounds it always makes in that hour. Those sounds that feel older than you are. Maple, I said again, the word coming out like a question, as if I were asking the sidewalk. Like the edge of my flashlight skirted the nearest bush. The light showed individual leaves, the spider web between 2 stems, a moth that moved and went dull in the dark again. I stood a few breaths longer. It isn't that I believed I could make the figure reappear by waiting. I couldn't even prove to myself that it had been anything other than the edge of my own worry. The small hours make ordinary things behave like facts you can't quite pin to the board. But I had seen it, or seen absence behave in a shape. My mind took hold of that and turned it like a coin. Behind me, something scuffed on the sidewalk and I pivoted too fast and drew the flashlight up in a quick beam. Maple froze with one paw raised, eyes gone wide and black, whiskers flared. He had the look he wore when he wasn't sure whether he was in trouble or about to be praised. He had somehow come up silent, the way cats do when they feel like ghosts at their own business. "Where did you?" I started, and then broke it off. I lowered the light and crouched. He didn't come to my hands right away. He stood, then cut right behind my heels as if he could pass through me and be aimed for home, without admitting it had been his choice to be out here. His collar didn't flash in the beam, and I realized the little red reflector had been caught on the latch that afternoon, and he'd lost the whole thing. I had meant to replace it. I had meant. We walked back along Bryan together, me a few steps out into the street to avoid spooking him with my presence directly behind him. He trotted ahead, so sure of the route that I had no business worrying about him at all, except that I would anyway. The houses slept. The porches breathed in their warm bulbs. A bicycle leaned under someone's stairs like a sleeping animal. City Park was a darker block between here and there, and I felt the pull of it, how the trees there held the night differently, thicker, as if the air had a grain. By the gate, Maple hesitated and looked up at the ring latch, and then back at me as if to say, "Pretense over." We went in. He made the quiet trill he makes when he's not trilling for anyone in particular, but has something to register. I held the screen with my knee so it wouldn't rock back and startle him, and he slipped through and became my cat again, a collection of habits. The small thump of his jump up to the counter where it wasn't allowed, the soft stretch of his forelegs against the rug with his claws sheathed. I put the flashlight down on the table and watched my hand. It didn't shake. That surprised me. My mouth had gone dry and then forgotten to be dry. The echo of the lamp's hum was still in my head. Maybe I had made a pinhole in the night with my worry, and peered through at something that was on its way to a place I couldn't name. I thought about going back out and standing there again, until I saw the pattern of the cracks on the sidewalk. Patterns you could memorize if you tried. I thought about walking around the block and approaching from a different angle to see if the light behaved oddly when I wasn't looking directly into it. I thought about calling my neighbor to ask if his camera picked up anything at the corner, and then pictured the pale circle of the lamp on the footage, the tiny bugs that swim in those videos, and my mind pocketed the idea and sat on it. Even if there had been a recording, I wasn't sure I wanted a second version of what I'd seen. I poured Maple a little scoop of kibble he didn't need, and listened to the way it sounded landing in the bowl. Maple ate like a creature who had never been outside a day in his life. He finished, licked the air once, and then followed me room to room as if this were all a trick of his to make me walk the house and check the doors. I did. I thumbed the lock on the screen. The universe didn't change its mind about me because I had put a barrier in place. It never has, but my hands needed work, and locks are honest work. If you had asked me then how to tell it, I might have shrugged and said it was a shape that stopped being there with a refusal that felt like physics and not like magic. The word 10, the word 20, the word yard, none of them feel right in that story when it comes to distance. I remember the texture of the concrete under my fingers, and the warmth of a bulb that had burned a long time, and the way the edges around that warmth grew softer, not sharper, when the thing stepped forward to cross. Later, when the day remade everything, the corner looked like any other. People pushed strollers. The same sour lamp hummed a little when it warmed at sundown. If the maintenance crew came and fixed it, I didn't notice. There are hundreds that look just like it on Mulberry alone. When I walked past, though, I caught myself shifting the beam of my attention the way I had shifted the beam of the flashlight, sliding it through air as if there were density there to respect. I didn't tell anyone at work. I didn't forget either. There is a story I could make where the shape meant something about the cat, as if the night had a logic that sets a price for small acts of carelessness, and then forgives you in the same breath. But that's not the story that belongs here. Maple slept on my chest that afternoon while I tried to nap on the couch and felt too alert to do it, as if my blood were talking to itself. He still tries the screen when the cooler kicks on and the door doesn't catch, and I still set my hand against it without looking the way you do when you've touched the same surface 1,000 times. The world makes such a convincing case for itself in daylight. You'd think that would erase whatever you saw when it was dark. On certain nights when the river of traffic on Mulberry thins, and the cottonwoods stand taller because the heat has inched south at last, I find an excuse to carry the trash out a bit too late, and stand on the back steps with my feet on the cool wood. I don't look hard at the gate. I check the latch with my thumb and forefinger and walk the yard in a slow arc. I watch the porch light touching the leaves, all their dull coins, and I practice not breathing for a second at a time, to feel the sound of what the city makes around me, to listen for the precise step of something following a path it doesn't care I am watching. Then I go back inside and nudge the screen closed with my knee, and lock it as if locks were a map you could read if you knew enough of their language. Evan had a map for places like this. Not an actual paper chart, but a lattice of rumors, shuttered windows, and the soft coordinates of places where people had stopped going. He liked how derelict buildings felt honest. The bones of a life exposed, no performance still running. He liked the thrill too. the little bright needle of it that threaded him and his friends together. The manor had been easy to talk about for months, and difficult to approach for minutes. It sat back from the county road, lopsided behind a wall of black-barked cottonwoods. After dark, everything past the broken gate became a deeper shade of night. They went anyway, Evan with a backpack and phone, Mira with a small flashlight and a nervous laugh. Theo already hopped over the low fence like it was a dare he'd made to himself. "Technically this is illegal," Mira whispered as they crossed the yard. The grass reached their knees and hissed as they pushed through. It felt like walking through the rustle of someone else's breathing. "Technically lots of things are illegal," Theo said. "We're not starting a fire." Evan didn't say anything. His pulse was high in his throat, and that needle-bright feeling stitched closer. Up close, the house wore its age like a mask. Paint sloughed off in plates, windows filmed with grime, a porch that tilted toward its own shadow. Someone had nailed the front door shut long ago. The back door gave after a shoulder and a pry. They slipped inside. The dark swallowed them and then returned them in small pieces, beam by beam as the flashlights probed. The air smelled like dust and wet wood. Somewhere water tapped, irregular as a bad dream about a clock. This was the thrill part. Evan moved through a parlor where wallpaper drooped like tired skin. He peered into a dining room stacked with broken chairs. He pointed out details, a carved banister, a fireplace with a cracked tile surround, like a docent of neglect. Every sound was an index, a mouse, a beam settling, his own breath rebounding off the emptiness. It was exactly what he loved. And yet other sounds intruded. Wrong notes in the composition. A soft scuff in the hall behind them when no one had moved. The faintest sigh from a door whose hinges didn't stir. Evan slowed. The needle tugged. "Did you hear that?" Mira whispered, light shaking over the floor. Her beam lit a scattering of papers fused by damp. Old bills, envelopes addressed by hand, someone's name repeating, each letter a small prayer that had never been answered. "It's a house," Theo said, but he said it softly. It happened in the west corridor, outside a room with a lidless piano. The wall there was clean in the way that only old neglect can be. A polished expanse of beige where the wallpaper had peeled off and left a skin of plaster. Evan had looked at that wall when they'd first passed, had scanned it, found nothing. Now when Mira's flashlight slid back over it, a message stood there. It was not written in paint or chalk, but in a gritty, darker tone like a finger had rubbed through dust. "Leave." Mira froze. Theo snorted a small, disbelieving laugh that dissolved into his throat. "That wasn't there," Mira said. Her voice climbed a note, and then flattened out again. Evan stared. He tried to summon the correct explanation. Teenagers, a trick of light, their own footprints scuffed up. But the dust still lay unbroken around it. The letters were clean, crisp at the edges. He felt watched. The knowledge arrived like a temperature, not rational, true. The hall narrowed, the ceiling pressed down, and then, because he was who he was, because curiosity had always made him lean closer to the things that pushed back, Evan stepped past the message. "Evan," Mira said. "We'll be quick," he said, and hated the tightness he heard in his voice. "It's just a wall." They went deeper. The tapping water stopped abruptly, as if it had been listening to them and chose another channel. The house reorganized itself around their footsteps. In the interior rooms, the dark was thicker. Their beams went out and came back choked with motes. Evan thought he could feel a draft without direction, like breath moving across skin. He angled left, then right, following nothing he could explain. The first sound, truly inexplicable, was a laugh that wasn't one. It was high and bent halfway through, a sound a person might make if a hand had clamped over their mouth. Evan's heart jolted hard enough to make his ribs ring. "Did you?" Theo began, and stopped. He had heard it too. Evan grounded himself by naming objects. "Radiator, mirror, door," he said in his head like a charm. He lifted his beam across a doorway, and at the far end of the room saw a narrow door set into the wall. A strange extra thing too small to be a closet, too deep to be a dumbwaiter. The house spoke again. Not in words at first, but in fragments. The sliding scrape of a chair, The brittle crack of something glass impacting hard. A voice saying please, not in a whisper but in a normal tone that made it worse. Then another voice, lower, a pressure wave under the syllables that felt like anger turned into a tool. Evan didn't understand the words, couldn't catch them as they fell past him, but the intent hit him like a heat flash. His light wavered. Mira made a soft sound, fear stripped down to its wire. He heard the slap of a hand. He knew that sound without ever having wanted to. And a thud, another plea choked off. The old piano in the hall gave a stringless groan, like something in it remembered vibrating. Evan smelled, or thought he smelled, cold metal and soap, and the felt of old curtains. The air thickened with something that didn't require sight to be real. Stop, Mira said to no one, to the room, to the past. The small door in the wall wasn't locked, only swollen into its frame. Evan put his fingers into the notch where a knob had once been. He pulled, the wood yelped, and came away, slow, and then all at once, as though deciding the matter. His beam fell into the space. They didn't scream. The brain has its own way of defending dignity. Inside, where the house might once have hit a linen press or a dumbwaiter shaft, lay a collapse of clothing and the delicate primitive of bones. The proportions were wrong for an adult. Small shoes, leather cracked into flower shapes, a thin gold chain tatted into dust. The flashlight shook just enough to make shadows crawl, but there was no mistaking what the room had been required to contain. Evan's body decided, before his mind did, he had to get out. He heard himself say, "We're leaving," like someone else had loaned him a voice. They retraced. The house seemed to close a fraction behind them, not maliciously but with the insistence of its own story, as if it had got tired of their lights and their breath. In the corridor, the word leave looked newly childish and newly absolute. They obeyed. Outside, the lawn's hiss became wind again. Evan put his hands on his knees and found he was shaking. He dialed 911 without discussing it, the numbers bright, the ACTA cord thrown back into a world where things were written down and followed up and made official. They waited by the road with the manor hulking, like a silhouette against an ink sky. When the first squad car arrived, its headlights made the grass look extra green, as if color had been hiding. A police officer named Alvarez listened, watched their faces, accepted the words they offered and the words they couldn't. In the morning, more cars, tape strung like caution-colored thread, people moving with the specific choreography of procedure. Evan gave his statement. He said he had heard things. He left out the way that anger had felt in his bones. He could not put that on a form. By afternoon, it was already a different kind of story. A detective found a report in a database, a name attached to a missing person from 20-some years ago, a girl who had walked away or had been collected by someone who said she would be returned soon. The house changed shape again under the weight of official language. Unsolved. Potential link. Remains consistent with. Notify next of kin. The ghostliness, if that's what it had been, turned its face. They saw the woman later. She stood by the tape, gray hair pulled back, a paper cup cooling in her hands. Evan recognized something in the way she stood, the posture of someone too careful to believe what she might be given. Officer Alvarez brought her closer to the porch, then stopped, asked her if she wanted to go further. She didn't. She looked up at the house and closed her eyes. When she opened them, she saw the three of them by the road. People with clipboards and radios moved between. She stepped a little closer, and in a voice so even it felt like ritual, said, "Thank you for not pretending you didn't find it." Evan nodded. He almost said he was sorry, as if apology could be placed like a flower somewhere it would be useful. Instead, he said, "We shouldn't have been there." It felt important to say it out loud, like setting something back where it belonged. She nodded. "But you were," she said, and that was the end of it. That night, Evan lay in his apartment and listened to the building's normal sounds. Radiators clicked, someone above him laughed. A full, unbent sound that meant nothing except itself. He thought about maps, about coordinates that are not on paper but in the way a person moves towards something. He thought about the word on the wall and the way he had stepped past it anyway. His curiosity had drawn a line and dared him. He had crossed it. and on the other side had found a story that didn't want them there because it had been waiting for its own conclusion. He got up, opened his laptop, and deleted the list that had taken him years to compile. The thrill had cracked into something else. It wasn't that he was afraid, though he was. It was that he had learned finally what some houses are for. Some places don't need a witness until they do, and then they require a different kind. He closed the lid. In the dark, the room felt like a room, not a listener. Outside, the ordinary city breathed. He listened back, and then slept. On the first day we worked in the big house, I learned how dust can have a weight to it. It wasn't just a hazy film you could swipe with a fingertip. It had grit and history, a taste if you talked while you were sweeping. My father showed me how to lay drop cloths and tape off molding so primer wouldn't bleed, and my older sister Mara teased a nail head level with the handle of a putty knife. We came home with the smell of damp wood and paint thinner in our clothes. It was early spring, and the nights could still go sharp, but the days were workable, and we ate sandwiches in the back of Dad's truck under a pale sky that made the wood line look farther away than it was. The place sat outside of town, down a single-lane road where grass pressed close to cracked asphalt and deer watched from a hedgerow of scrub hawthorn. Calling it a mansion made it sound grand. It was large, yes, and once mustered symmetry, the twin chimneys, the central hall, the formal rooms. But all that had sagged. Birds had lived in some attic soffits for years. Somebody had removed a staircase banister and used it for firewood. Dad's contract was to make it watertight and respectable on a bare minimum budget, so a developer could decide if it was worth saving. He liked jobs like that, complicated and close to the edge. It made him feel useful. We didn't live on the property, but it filled our days. I went to community college in the mornings, 2 classes, then changed into work clothes in a bathroom stall, and drove out with a sack of screws and a 5-gallon bucket. Mara had finished school and was half employed as Dad's shadow, which she pretended to hate but never left. She knew where Dad left his tape measure. She could set a window shim by feel, even without seeing level bubbles. When she was there, he was calmer, less fussy with measurements he'd redo 3 times alone. There was a rhythm to those weeks. Scrape, sand, tape, prime, sand, fill. Between movements I learned the house's noises. A seam in the dining room crown ticked afternoon. As the sun slid past the windows, a vent in a second-floor bedroom breathed like a sleeping person through a hidden path of gaps and duct, and the hollow curve of a removed knob and tube fixture. Dust rose and settled in circles. If light hit at the right angle, you could see motes hang, then drift in little parabolas, as though drawn to some slow-moving current. We weren't supposed to be there at night. That was Dad's rule and the developers too. No electricity beyond a few work lamps, no security system, no reason to risk it. But places like that pull at people. I'd be at the coffee shop on Warren Street in Hudson after class, still in my work boots, and friends would ask about it. They wanted to see the staircase that had lost its hand, the room with the yellow wallpaper stained as if the wall itself had once wept. They wanted photographs. I said no at first. I was loyal by nature, and Dad had asked me to keep the place quiet. Then one day I carried my thermos out to the truck and looked back at my friends' faces, bored, a little curious, already forgetting me, and I told them to meet me Friday late when Dad would be home by then and asleep. I didn't tell Mara until the last minute. That was my mistake. I told myself it would be fine, a quick walkthrough, flashlights low, an hour at most. I told myself the shine in her eyes meant she wanted this as much as I did, to show we weren't only an extension of Dad's work. She said we'd better bring the trash bag we'd been using for old linoleum scraps, just in case someone drank something and didn't want to carry the bottle out. We left a note for Dad that we were with friends, which wasn't a lie, and went. It was off-season for tourists, and the road had an emptiness that made the night feel larger than usual. Our friends, 3 of them, 2 from class and 1 from the shop, pulled in behind us and parked close so our taillights overlapped red on the gravel. The house was black except for a low square of light where we'd left a work lamp aimed at a ceiling we were skimming in joint compound. We hadn't planned that. I had forgotten to unplug it earlier. Maybe the light was what made everything feel less like trespass and more like presentation. like we were taking a bow for a room that would be new again. We kept voices down anyway and went in through the back. Cold air moved in the halls the way water moves in a slow, shallow creek. Dust came up with each step and then hung in our beams. We showed the front parlor and the patched fireplace. The breakfast room with windows that had lost their weights and fell unless you propped them. I could hear my boots and my breath. My friends made the little appreciative noises people make when they don't know what else to say. And I thought, see, it's nothing, just a walkthrough. My shoulders unclenched. There was a door on the second floor that Dad called the trouble door. It didn't lock right and the casing had shifted, so if a person closed it behind them, it took two to coax it open. Behind it was a narrow hall to a section we'd barely touched because the roof there needed repair first. Dad had told us to stay out because he wasn't sure about the floor. It'll do for now, he'd said, but let's not make a habit. He always talked like that, a little formal when he meant no. My friend Cal asked what was back there. I said just more of the same, and tried to steer him toward the stair. But Mara had already crossed to the trouble door. She sang under her breath sometimes when she was thinking. Not words, but notes. And I could just hear the fall of that habit in her throat if I leaned my ear toward her. She put her hand on the knob, looked at me, looked at our friends and decided. The angle of her chin said it all. I should have stepped forward and touched her wrist. Instead, I lifted the trash bag to make a joke about not leaving anything, and the noise of the plastic in my hands drowned out the small click of the latch. The moment after a door is shut at night in a house that isn't yours is particular. It is softer than you expect. The sound belongs to the house more than to you. I kept the light low and stepped after her with the others. The hall smelled like cold paper. There were built-in shelves with a scattering of broken glass where a door had fallen. My light picked out the lifted heads of nails in the floor like a line of little dull eyes. We didn't go far. A threshold, a turn, a room the size of 2 beds with a pigeon's nest in the corner, and a mirror faced to the wall. Our friends were good, careful, sweet with their curiosity, the kind of people who apologize to a doorknob if they bumped it. They kept to the middle boards. It's possible that nothing that mattered happened there. It's possible the thing already started before we even arrived. I was at the back of the line when it changed. Cal was in front of me and Mara beyond him. Then Tess and Ren near the window. Tess's beam crossed mine and caught dust at a slant that made our light look thick, as if it could be scooped. There was a low sound, like a drawer eased out without lifting first to clear its runners. It might have been the house. When I moved my light off the dust, it landed on the angle of Mara's cheek and the edge of her eye, and she was not looking at us anymore. Her head was tipped the way you tilt it, to identify a far-off sound, but her focus was inward, as if she were watching something on the other side of her forehead. Her breath changed. Then she shivered so hard I worried her teeth would hit. The back of her work shirt shifted with a ripple of skin under it, like when a horse throws a fly off its haunches. I said her name. I didn't think before I spoke. The word just came. Ren said we should go. Not whispering now, but flat and practical. Tess reached for Mara's elbow and almost touched her and then didn't. Mara turned and for a moment there was nothing I recognized in the way her mouth almost smiled. It was 2 levels of expression at the same time. Her face as a surface thing, and then something else behind it that didn't know how to use that surface. She took a step without looking at the floor. Cal made a noise meant to be a laugh and failed. In the hall, the air felt colder. The trouble door stuck like it always did. I put my shoulder to the edge where the frame was weakest, and pushed and found myself breathing in the dust that came down from the header, with a taste like old plaster and mouse. I've never been so aware of what air holds until then. It was as if something fine and invisible had multiplied itself and was pressing at the skin inside my cheeks. We made it out. We didn't run. Everybody always asks that. No, we didn't run. We moved as one of those groups in old photographs where you can see that nobody wants to move first, and nobody wants to be last. On the stairs down, Mara kept that tipped head listening expression, and once put her foot wide so her boot slid off a step. And if Tess hadn't been a kind person with steady hands, Mara would have gone sideways into the newel post that was only studs now. When we reached the back door, a breath of warmer air came from outside and hit my face. It should have let something go inside me. It did not. Under the truck's cab light, Mara's skin had that washed-out tone. people get when they've been ill a long time, where the pigments seem to have stepped back from the surface like a tide pulling away from a sandbar. Her pupils looked wider than the light should have made them. She had always been warm. You could tell when she took a wrist and counted off beats for Dad when he forgot the time. But she was cold in a way that kept refilling, as if I were pouring something from a pitcher with a hole in it. I wrapped her in my sweatshirt. Tess said she could drive our truck and I could sit with Mara. Ren collected the bottles from our friend's hands without saying anything. Count tied the trash bag and his fingers shook. Dad woke up when he heard the truck. He didn't ask questions right away. His body runs on work, and so he always greets emergencies by doing, and we needed that. He helped me get Mara onto the couch, and then he stood and looked down on her in the way fathers do when they're trying to scan a problem for a scene. After a moment, he said we were going, and we went. He drove to the emergency room, and I sat in the back with Mara and watched our reflection move across dark window glass, a small bright interior sliding through a larger blackness. At intake, a nurse with a badge that said El Marquez took a temperature and a heartbeat and asked gentle questions in a voice meant for the middle of the night. A doctor came who had the calm iron of someone who has seen a lot of things and rests anyway. They asked if Mar had taken anything. No. If she had hit her head. No. If there had been fumes. I started to say yes because of the solvent and joint compound, because of the room's cold paper smell, because of dust, always dust. But what they meant was serious fumes, a spill or a misuse, and there was nothing like that to offer. They asked where we had been, and we said we had been home, and I felt the lie get into my mouth and lodge there like grit under my tongue. They kept her for observation. This is how these sentences go. They do not hold the night. She went from trembling to stillness as if a wave had passed and the water had become glass. They said words like dissociative and conversion and stress response. Those are good words. Honest words that give shape without pretending to know everything. They were not a solution. After 2 days, they transferred her to a facility up the valley. The doctor shook Dad's hand and told him to rest. Dad listened as if the doctor were speaking through 2 doors. I didn't tell him about the night at the house. Not then. Not later. Each morning I thought today, and then the day unrolled itself with things it required. A call to the developer, a visit to the facility with fresh clothes, a run for groceries, and the time for telling never seemed to line up with how tired Dad looked. His shoulders had a new angle to them. Standing still made him sway as if he were on a boat on a river with a current you couldn't see. After a week, he went back to the job. We finish what we start, he said to himself, to the saw, to the silence. I watched him set up ladders and lay out tools, and I carried buckets behind him like an assistant in a magic act that had lost its trick. While he worked, I tried to learn something that would make the lie inside me break apart. I went to the county clerk's office and asked about past owners. Pretending a school project, a woman with a blue sweater took a long time to locate a set of photocopies from a time before digitizing. There had been an owner in the 1980s who lost the house to taxes and refused to leave for a while, living in a single room and drawing the blinds tight at noon. Before him, a pair of siblings had used it as a sort of boarding place for quiet, lonely men who paid in cash and left no forwarding addresses. It wasn't an institution, not in any licensed sense, just an arrangement that worked until a winter where pipes burst and someone with authority took notice. The clerk said it looked like a headache for the county and closed the folder like you cap a jar. I kept those facts and carried them around. They didn't land. They didn't answer anything except to make a background darker. Maybe that was enough to make things uneasy. Maybe the way light fell on dust did the rest. Dad had always kept his promises to jobs. It was a point of pride with him, and it had carried us through years when nothing else did. He began to fail this time. He would lay out a plan and change it the next day, then blame the lumber or the temperature or the scaffolding. He bought a gallon of shellac and then forgot where he put it. I found it later in the trunk of his car under a folded towel. He would walk into rooms of the house and come out not having done anything, and at night he stared at the ceiling, as if it had begun to grow letters he could learn to read. I went to see Mara, and told her what the doctor had said. She looked at me with concentration, as if I were speaking a language she nearly knew. She was polite to the aides, careful with cups. She could sit in a chair for an hour without shifting. Her hands were cold. When she told me she had dreamed of sanding a door smooth and found. When she lifted her hands that they were gray. I wanted to say, I know that dust. It's nothing. It's only plaster. But I didn't. Something about the story felt like a place at the edge of a field where the grass changes shape and you know not to walk there. In late May, the developer called Dad and said they needed a walkthrough with someone from the bank. Dad nodded into the phone. He nodded after he hung up. He nodded to his tools. Then he went to the house and I went after him, because I didn't like his aspect. He moved with a new economy that worried me, a straight line without thought. He unlocked the back door and went straight in. He didn't look for what was missing, the places where we had placed ourselves in the work. He went to the dining room and out of the room again, and in the hall he paused. The trouble door upstairs had been fixed by then. A carpenter from the developer's crew had reset the casing. Dad looked up as if he could feel where it had been before. Then he went back down and out, and when I followed him, he was at the truck pulling a red can from the bed. I knew what it was, and I still thought I could talk him out of it. I told him we would finish. I told him we would quit. I told him this wasn't ours to decide. He didn't look at me. He had that far inward look I had seen on Mara's face, but it meant a different thing in him. Not absence, but a narrow, terrible presence. All of his attention bent into a point. He walked through rooms and made small gestures with his hand as if he were blessing thresholds. He did not say any of the obvious words, the ones you'd use if you meant to be stopped. His face was pale, without heat. When the scent hit me, all solvent and summer and something sweet that was almost like old fruit, my stomach folded. He didn't make a show of it. He worked like he was patching a leak. After he stood with the can at his feet and a box of matches in his hand. I thought then of everything that would follow, the call, the billboards, the county, the things people would say, and finally I tried to bodily take the thing from him. He had been a gentle man my whole life, strong but careful, and he put me aside without hurting me, just moved me back like a piece of furniture in his path. Then he did it. The fire started quietly. It always does in stories. Like a creature you don't see until it's halfway across the room. It took the edges of the rooms first, then stepped inward. The smoke made a column where the stair had been. When it reached the ceiling of the front parlor, it found the old lath under the plaster and raced along that secret grid, and you could read the house by the lines the fire drew. We stood across the road with our sleeves over our faces and watched a space we had filled with hours go from a thing to a memory in the time it takes for 3 slow breaths. The developer came in a car with hazard lights on, and the bank man never arrived. The volunteer fire department did, and they laid hoses in arcs and made a sound like a steady breath. And in the end, all that was left was steam and black, and a heap where the center halls had fallen. The county charged Dad and then made a deal because they knew him, and because it was easier. The developer sued and then settled because it was easier. Nothing that was easy repaired anything. But people in offices are paid to move things from one pile to another until the piles are gone. We moved apartments 3 times and ended up above a nail salon where the air always smelled faintly like acetone. Dad's truck was taken and then returned and then failed inspection and sat for months. I got a second job and then a third less for the money than for the hours it took from me, that would have been otherwise open to thinking. We visited Mara and sometimes she would look at the window in a way that made me think she could smell rain before it arrived. Everyone else eventually stopped asking about the house and began to ask about the weather. When I finally told Dad about that night, I expected it to come out like a confession in a movie, where the music makes it clear that truth is better than any lie you can carry. I told him in our kitchen at the little table with the visitor chair missing, 1 plastic cap on a leg, and the words there were small and ordinary. He listened. He did not ask for details. He said a sentence everyone says in this sort of story, that it wouldn't have changed anything, and I knew he meant to be kind. I also knew he believed it in a way that did not contain my belief. It would not have changed the strain that made his hand so steady on the match. It might have made a seam somewhere earlier we could have pulled. I have kept the trash bag from that night. Folded so many times it's gone soft at the creases. That is probably the most foolish thing I've ever written down. It sits in a drawer with spare batteries and flashlight bulbs. Sometimes when I change a bulb, a ridge of black plastic edges into view. I don't touch it. It is one of those little private bargains people make with themselves to feel like they could undo something if they had to. When I clean, I see the dust rise and hang where the sun makes a square on the table, and then settle in an even finer layer, too fine to gather with a cloth. I have learned there are kinds of dust that don't want to be wiped up. They want to become part of the thing they land on. That seems to be true for other things too. We are scattered now the way families scatter when too much heat is applied for too long. Dad lives one town over with a friend who tolerates his slow mornings and his careful attempts at dinner. I live here above the salon and keep a schedule that keeps me moving so the hours don't open up. Mara is quiet, steady, present when she can be, and otherwise still. On the days I visit, a little light falls on the institutional chairs in the waiting room, and the particles in that light move like a pattern. I almost learned once and then forgot. I sit with her and talk about small things, and don't touch the place in the conversation where a scene might be if I pressed. When I come home, I run water in the sink and watch the way the stream breaks into tiny bubbles around the rim of the drain and goes out of sight. I turn off the light and let the dust resettle. I open the drawer and see the edge of plastic, and I close the drawer without taking it out.